So I'm going to call this meeting to order at 6 o'clock, and Chris Pearsall is our minute taker. Before we get started, I have a few items to add to the agenda as a result of the new bill about voting, and I just want to be sure we're covered. I don't usually add action items, but these are pretty important. I want to make sure we have them in place so that we don't mess up town meeting day. So under item 3, I'm going to add an action item to move the deadline for the consent of candidate forms to 2/1/21 as allowed by H48. Currently the date is 1/25/21, so that would just be action to move the deadline. And then a little later on, after we determine the date for Australian ballot voting, I'm going to add an action item that's to commingle the results of all articles on the Australian ballot. And then under that one more item to authorize use of a voting tabulator. And those are the additions. So I'm going to move to public comment, and Patty had asked if she could make a comment. So I'm going to have Patty go ahead.
Thank you, everybody. I was hoping to speak last night, and I hope it's appropriate that I speak tonight, even though it's not quite about the budget per se. But
make a comment. Can you just tell your name so the minute taker can capture it and what town you live in?
Yep. So my name is Patty Schernhuber, and I live in Lincoln, and I am the second grade teacher in Lincoln. I have a letter that is on behalf of the staff at Lincoln Community School that I would like to read tonight. And then I will send it to you so you have it in person. Dear MAUSD board members, this was written on January 10th, 2021. Thank you for your continued dedication and hard work towards achieving the important goal of educating our children. We understand the difficult position that you are in, and we believe that the problems we face are ones that we are capable of solving together. We first and foremost wish to support and maintain small schools as community assets. Therefore, we strongly recommend that you vote no to the current proposal. At the same time, we propose that it is in the district's best interest to engage the collective expertise of the highly qualified and devoted staff of all of MAUSD schools to create solutions which will ensure an effective education plan, even if reductions have to be made. We ask you to insist that our Superintendent Reen implement collaborative, in-depth problem-solving sessions with the principals, coordinators, coaches, teachers, and support staff, providing a productive platform where the ideas of the people who are on the ground directly working with children will produce not only a creative solution, but will increase the investment and morale of the staff. We believe that this, at the very least, is the right place to start. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. And you can just send it to me and I'll send it along to be in the board minutes.
Super. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Is there any other public comment at this time? Tim Dumont.
Yeah, so I know there was 2 meetings in 2 days, which can sometimes be hard, but there was no agenda posted for the public within 48 hours of tonight's meeting. And so that's a little unfortunate just because I think someone like Patty, for example, if the people knew there was public comment tonight at the budget meeting at the beginning, people may have tuned in to hear Patty's incredible talk there. It's a little unfortunate. And I know last night was a lot. And you guys put in tons of time, but there's no agenda posted. So that is a violation of the open meeting law. And it's unfortunate. The second thing I'll say is that the constant conversation, although not really in depth, about the difference in per pupil spending is, I think, really interesting for a couple of reasons. I had sent an email to the superintendent back in December asking for like an itemized breakdown of per pupil. Like I didn't understand what I was talking about. Just wanted a breakdown. And within that, I wanted to know within each school, how do the coordinators and coaches, which are going to different schools on different days, I understand, how do they fit into that per pupil spending within each town and itemized so we can understand, you know, Lincoln's getting, I don't know how it works, but Lincoln's getting billed this much, and Starksboro this much. And I understand not all of them go to all the schools, but that's an important number. I was told no such positions exist. And I think I was using the wrong terminology, but I think you all know what I'm talking about. The coordinators and coaches, I've heard 20 positions, 25. I think people need to know how many, the cost, and how much of the per pupil across all the towns that number accounts for. Second, if you are including the cost of debt associated with the Lincoln Community School and the per pupil spending for that school, that is a decision that the town of Lincoln made before there was a merger. And it would be interesting to know what that per pupil looked like if you removed that. And that sort of just goes to the really, it's the most important thing that you break down and itemize per pupil for not just school board members that have, frankly, I've tried asking multiple school board members and they do not know the answers to these questions, and it's not their fault. You guys are trying your best. You're spending huge amounts of time on these matters. And I used to staff 4 statutorily required boards, the Vermont State Treasurer, and it's hard work. It's really hard work to be staff, but you guys need information so that you can then answer emails, talk about these things reasonably in these meetings. And I honestly feel super frustrated that this type of stuff isn't just out there. And I feel bad for those school board members that are struggling to understand and wrap their arms around these issues, but it's not their fault. It's not particularly the superintendent's fault or his staff. It's really a fault of the way that this was rushed through in the process, because that's why my antenna went up in December. So these are just, and I didn't want to bring it up last night because frankly, you guys had a long night. So I saved this for today, but that per pupil spending, when I asked a month ago, it's broken out amongst the different towns. We can't even tell you, frankly, what it might be for a Lincoln. We don't budget that way, but obviously, because of what's been said the last few meetings, people are on the verge of obsessing over how much Lincoln's per pupil spending is. So before that gets brought up again in a public meeting, and we need to understand what that number looks like. We need to understand what it looks like, not according to the proposal, but just in general. And not just this year, but last year, the year before, so we can see if it's changed over time. And that's just basic stuff. And I have to say that it's very frustrating. So many members of the public have spent tons of time listening to conversations, but as Rob and Caleb and Dave and Sarah and so many others last night brought up, there needs to be an open discussion about the per pupil spending, not just here's how much it costs. We need it broken down. Thank you. And I hope there's public comment at the end too.
Okay, there is public comment in the end. Can I ask one question? Where is it you were looking for the agenda?
I was looking on the page for agendas and minutes on your website.
Okay. All right, I'll look into that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other public comment? Okay. So we'll move into our discussion piece. I just want to remind board members that there is some time for questions tonight, but this is also time for us to listen to what the community has to say. And don't feel like we're not going to have a chance to get deeper into the budget. If we need to, we can do that at our next meeting, but just want to keep it balanced so that we can hear from community members tonight who have logged in to listen to this presentation. So Patrick, I guess we'll start with you.
Dawn, can I just ask a quick process question?
Sure.
Are you inviting community members to just raise their hands to ask questions or do you want to clarify how you want to do that?
So I think we'll let the board members ask if they have, a clarifying question they need to understand something right at the moment, and then not getting too deep, like I said, and then I'll look for hands up for other questions. Does that answer your question?
Yep, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I'll start sharing my screen. I'll walk through a presentation in similar format to what we've seen in the past, and then we can turn it over to questions. Okay. So again, we'll start with assumptions as we've done in the past. So this is what we're looking at for assumptions for these January figures, specifically for FY22. I'm going to share some assumptions for the FY23 numbers that we kind of touched on last night as well. But again, and these assumptions haven't changed tremendously since last time. But again, assumes we're not filling any of the one-year positions or positions that weren't filled this year, which is about 9.8 FTE. The equalized pupil has changed. This is now assuming a drop of 7.98. Last time was just over 3. So this has us about 4 or 5 equalized pupil less than what we saw last time. That resulted from a change that came to us from the state in terms of our equalized pupil draft. And we identified an error and we notified the state of that error. So we're anticipating a change in another version of the equalized pupil count. But at this point in time, what came from the state represents a 7.98 decrease in equalized pupils. So that's what we're working from tonight, and that could change even by Tuesday's presentation. It still assumes an FY20 fund balance of $966,229 that has not been audited yet. Auditors are kind of backed up trying to figure out what to do with COVID monies. So audits are slow to come. I'm not sure if anybody has their audit complete yet. Still assumes the spending threshold increase of a 0.18% increase. A lot of assumptions on revenue, and assumes a 9.9% healthcare premium increase. When we look at the figures behind the projected FY23, again, we're going to have a best case and a worst case, and then there's a projected that kind of lands in the middle. So this is in reference to that one that lands in the middle that you're going to see side by side with some of the FY22 figures on some of the slides. This assumes half of the expected impact from the changes to the weighting formula, that sort of phased in approach. Assumes that about 75% of our home study students return. Assumes a 4.26% increase in expenses over FY22. Assumes an equalized pupil drop of 90.49. Assumes that we use 400K as from the fund balance. That the spending threshold goes back to what the increases have historically been, which is around 2.35%. And assumes that we do get the revenue increase as a result of the special education block grant funding change. So again, that's what's behind that projected FY23. In terms of the worst case, best case, and again, these are in quotations because things can always be worse and they can always be better. These are kind of the more extreme to the disadvantageous side and the more extreme to the advantageous side. When we look at that sort of worst case scenario, this would assume we feel the full effect of the weighting study, that we use the actual ADM from FY21 when they calculate our 2-year average, not the hold harmless ADM. It assumes we don't get any relief from the construction services costs that we have in our budget, assumes there's no fund balance that can be applied, that assumes we spend all of the money budgeted for next year. Still assumes that the threshold increases at a typical rate at that 2.35. 50% of our homeschooled students return, still makes assumptions about revenue. Assumes our expenditures rise at a rate that we've seen historically, and assumes that the yield holds at the FY22 estimate. When we go to the other end, some of the assumptions are that there's no effect from the weighting study, that they do use the hold harmless ADM from FY21. So that kind of brings us back to that lower or the higher ADM rate than what was actual. And again, that's the average daily membership. It's a way to count students. Assumes we get the benefit of the construction service costs being waived from our spending per equalized pupil. Still assumes the 400K fund balance. Assumes a more favorable yield, kind of going back to what it was, not the yield estimate that we've received recently. Assumes that the threshold again reflects that historical increase. Assumes we get all of our homeschooled students back. Again, assumes our revenue holds and that the expenditures rise as we've seen historically. So those are some of the assumptions behind the figures that you're going to see as we look at FY23. So the fund balance is something that comes up, and this hasn't really changed. My recommendation from the beginning has been that we apply as much of the fund balance as possible to the capital reserve fund, in part because we have some capital needs. So we have some facilities with some need, but also in part because the less fund balance we apply to offset taxes next year, the greater likelihood that we're going to be well positioned as we build FY23, because we'll have a smaller fund balance to have to sustain without feeling the drop of revenue. And to give an example, if we, to use round numbers, if we apply $1 million of a fund balance to offset the taxes for FY22 in this budget, anything less that we carry forward into FY23 becomes a revenue shortfall. It's a decrease in revenue. And that decrease in revenue would have to be made up by reduced spending or by increasing taxes. The flip side, if we were to move forward $0 from the fund balance to offset taxes, then anything more than zero that we apply would have the benefit of a increase in revenue, which would help us. So strategically, the less fund balance we apply to offset taxes, the better positioned we are for the following year to get a budget to pass at a reasonable rate. So nothing has changed there strategically, but we do want to make sure that we're staying under the spending threshold by, I don't know if I'd say a comfortable margin, but a margin. And the target being plus or minus that $50,000 range. And so with some updated figures, the recommendation right now is that we apply $366,229 in fund balance to offset taxes for next year. Last time that we met, it was a $400,000 recommendation, so a slight change there. When we look at the FY22 column, you can see the increase in total expenses. That represents a 1.02% increase in spending. When we were last together, it was a 0.6% increase in spending. So we had some projected expenses increase a little bit, but we also had some revenue change as well. The net effect really keeps our cost per equalized pupil about the same, even with that greater decrease than what we had anticipated. So that really brings our spending per equalized pupil down to just under the spending threshold. And in total, that keeps us just under $48,000 under the spending threshold. So we're right in that window of 50,000 that we wanted to shoot for. And again, this has all those assumptions from that slide on FY22.
So
here you're seeing, yeah, sorry, go ahead and jump in.
Excuse me, so the number of percent increase that'll show up on the ballot will be the 0.2% increase per pupil?
That's correct. So they're gonna, on the ballot, will show the total expenses. So that 31,720,679, that shows up. And then it will also show our cost per equalized pupil. So the 18,756.28. And then it will then show, which represents a 0.2% increase in the cost per pupil. So as we look at FY23, and certainly feel free to jump in, and again, I can't see hands and things as well, so board members jump in, and Don, whenever you're ready to turn it over to community members, that's fine too. For FY23, you can see our projected spending, and again, revenue, et cetera, and this has us just over 2 million, just over 2.25 million over the spending threshold, given those assumptions for that projected FY23 that I gave you on that slide.
Oh, Rob has his hand up.
Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
Just a quick question. Has the district been in touch with those, I think you believe at one point you said 77 students who have withdrawn from the district and are in home study? Have we been in touch to sort of have a temperature check if they're looking to re-enroll in the district?
Not at this time, no.
Thank you.
So again, we kind of saw a snapshot of this last night when we were talking about FY23, I think related to some questions that Steve had. And so this shows perhaps a slightly updated version of even what you saw last night, but still north of the $2 million mark over the spending threshold without some changes. And what we had talked about last night, this figure of just over 2 million represents about 25 positions. If that's what we needed to do, was reduce positions to get that spending threshold or to get our spending down to the threshold. And so now we're sort of looking at 23 and kind of expanding that out a little bit, looking at a best case and a worst case as compared to the projected. So again, this projected column is what you saw on that previous slide. And when we look at our best case scenario, given those assumptions that I laid out on a previous slide, that has us a little under $500,000 under the spending threshold. And we go to the more worst case scenario, we're just over $4 million over the spending threshold. So again, this figure represents about 25 positions if we're about 2 million over, and the 4 million, of course, represents about 50 positions. And then we could play that down here to the $500,000 is a handful of positions. So if we think about it that way, that's sort of what's on the horizon as we anticipate FY23. So this is, I'm sorry, that should say October to January now. This is an attempt to kind of, again, go back to when we first saw a draft budget and kind of walk through what the changes have been month to month. And as we look at January, you can see spending has gone up some, as I had indicated, as did the revenue. And the net effect was a decrease to our education spending. And with that decrease to the education spending, along with a decrease to our equalized pupil count, that kept our cost per pupil pretty close to the same, within $3, and keeps us under the spending threshold and just about hits that $50,000 target. This is an effort to demonstrate the impact to the taxes for folks that pay based on income. And again, this uses the 366,000 of fund balance, and it uses the hold harmless figures. And here you can see the impact. And again, this assumes the Addison County median household income from 2018, which is still, as far as we know, the most recent household median income information that we can get. Shows what the impact would be, comparing FY21 to 22 and the increase.
Patrick, does this include the state's 9-cent add-on from the yield letter?
I believe it does. I'll let Floyd weigh in to confirm.
Sorry, it does, which bodes well based on some of the information we're starting to see trickling out, that the net effect of the tax impact may improve.
It might be helpful if this is going to be part of the final information package to note that here somewhere.
Yeah, Floyd and I have had some back and forth conversations about that. You know, we hear things, and then there's what we have in writing.
Yeah.
We have tended to go in terms of a presentation with what we have in writing. And then we hope that what we hear, we actually get confirmed in writing so that we can sort of bank on it to the extent that we can bank on anything.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that. It's just that if people look at this slide and their increase is 4.64, and then they looked at your previous slide, it said it was only going up by one something. I can see people scratching their heads because they don't know where the extra percentage increase came from.
Sure.
I think it's important to recognize that that a flat tax was a 9% increase with this new yield, meaning a flat spending.
Yeah, I may have my terminology wrong, Floyd. It's just, I know that the state was throwing something on top of what we're doing here, whether we were doing a good job of it or not, they were throwing some increase on top of it.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. All right, so this slide now is using the new CLA figures that have come out, showing what happens to the tax rate. Floyd, is there anything you want to point out about the CLAs as they've come out?
Just it's interesting. Bristol took a pretty good increase in their property values, which reflects in a lower CLA. On the other end of the spectrum, Lincoln, their property value picture is less than is moved in the other direction. So it's actually improved, lessened the tax impact for Lincoln. Moncton is more on the Bristol side, New Haven again on the Bristol side, Starksboro in between Lincoln and New Haven, but still Starksboro taking a pretty good increase to the tax rate due to the CLA impact. Any questions on CLA, what that means? We've kind of talked about it a bunch, but my assumption is that it's a known item. I'm happy to speak to it if there's a question on how it works a little.
Floyd, if you could just, I understand it, but I'm sure someone doesn't, and just a little more information never hurts.
Great, thanks, happy to. Common level of appraisal, and it's the way the state takes the valuation of properties in different towns across the state from an appreciation or depreciation standpoint reflective to market value, and then applies a number to each one of our towns. A number above 100 means that the common level appraisal is assuming that the appraisal in that town is higher than the market value. So you get a benefit there. And then the flip side of it, a lower one is saying that you may be appraised at $1, but we really think it's worth $1.08. And that would reflect a Bristol 92% CLA.
And then we have Nancy Cornell.
Thanks. Two questions. One is, would you just say again, Floyd, when that the value of properties went down and the CLA went up? What did you say when you started?
Sure. So, for example, the Lincoln common level appraisal last year was a lower number than this year. So that effectively, when divided by the adjusted homestead tax rate, gives a lower property tax rate. The inverse, so looking at this slide, the 92.25 for Bristol, for example, Bristol was a 96% CLA, common level of appraisal last year, which meant that the property value moving to 92%, or the CLA moving to 92%, reflects that the state recognizes that the appraised value in Bristol has increased by 4%, rough numbers in this example. And that's applied over the whole property valuation for the town.
So New Haven's CLA has gone up quite a bit, hasn't it? I mean, last time I looked was maybe 6 months, a year ago. I thought it was around 85 or lower.
I don't think that's accurate. I think
No?
I'll pull it up here in just a second.
Well, it's okay. It's okay. Don't spend time on that. I can look. But I have one other question. I heard not long ago that to do a reappraise, it's been very clear that if your CLA is low, it really hurts you on tax rate, really increases your tax rate. If it's under 85%, you're required to do a reappraisal. But I've been hearing that to do a reappraisal, a town now, because it's so complex, has to hire professional appraisers, and that it's very hard to find them. And therefore, towns are waiting 1-2 years, even longer, once they try to get a reappraiser to help them, a professional one. So I've been hearing there's a big wait time on reappraisals, and also that nobody's training new people to be reappraisals. Have you heard that same thing?
I know that there's a backlog on it. To address your question about New Haven, the CLA last year was 93.51.
Okay. So I'm way off. Thank you, though.
Sure.
And Paul Verlenza has his hand up. Paul?
Sorry about that.
That's right.
I'm trying to understand the relationship between, and maybe there is none, per pupil cost and tax rate. So if Lincoln has a high per pupil cost, why is the tax rate lower than others? Is that simply the CLA calculation, or is there something else going on?
Well, there's no correlation between the town of Lincoln's student count and the town of Lincoln's tax rate. The tax rate is driven by our district. Why, if you look, the homestead tax rate across the board is the same for everyone. Where the change comes in is the valuation of the property through the common level of appraisal. So a common tax across our district of 1.7227 is then manipulated through the state's structure of a common level of appraisal, meaning in looking at this slide, in Lincoln's case, where the CLA works to their advantage, the tax rate drops from the tax rate that is developed from the equalized pupil divided by the education spending number, which is where that number comes from, and then comparing that to Bristol with a less than 100% CLA, it drives that tax rate up by 15-cent different tax rate, Lincoln versus Bristol.
And I would add to that,
So
Paul,
that
that
go ahead.
I was just going to say, we have a single cost per equalized pupil as a district. It's not differentiated by town. And that equalized pupil cost is a driving factor in the tax rate. Years ago, when we were not a unified district, each town did have their own cost per pupil, and that did contribute to each town's adjusted homestead tax rate, which was then again multiplied by or factored in by the CLA. So used to have different cost per pupil. Now we have the same. Used to have different adjusted homestead tax rates. Now we have all the same.
So for state purposes, it's simply the district per pupil cost that's relevant. So I'm wondering why there's so much discussion about per pupil cost by town then, if that's not something the state looks at.
I don't think there should be.
That's a longer question, so I just put it out there.
I think when we were talking last night about the cost, how it costs more to educate Lincoln than it does Bristol. I think it's simply a matter of how many students there are in those schools divided by the overall education spending budget. That's my guess.
Yeah, and that was the idea.
I'll jump into that one a little bit. And to really oversimplify it, it's really just the math of this. If we hire a, let's say librarian, and a librarian in Bristol with 200 and some odd kids might cost per student annually, $298, because the Lincoln, both schools need a librarian. So from an equitable standpoint, it's important to have a librarian at both schools. But when you divide them, and this is where the economies of scale come in that are so impactful in that consolidation model. So taking that same idea of just the librarian, it costs $298 for a librarian at Bristol. It costs $605 per student to have a librarian in Lincoln. And it's a big number by a small number. It's really all it is.
So Floyd, that suggests to me then that using per pupil cost has very little to do with the quality of education that's being offered. In other words, in Lincoln, I think we currently have 84 students. If we got another, our per cost would go down significantly, but really the quality of the education hasn't changed.
I missed a lot of what you said. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you broke up.
I think I can jump in though. I think what I heard you say, what the parts of that I could put together was, if you got an influx of students, the cost per student would go down. And I would say, yes, that's true, while we're trying to maintain the level of education. And I think that's important to know. So it's been crystal clear as we've become a unified district. Our interest is in providing an equitable education to students across our schools. In the smaller schools, that's going to mean a higher cost per pupil than in the bigger schools, as we try to provide that equitable educational experience. So we're choosing to focus on equitable outcomes and opportunities, more so than choosing to focus on equitable spending per student. That's intentional. That's philosophically 100% what we need to do. And it doesn't change the fact that there is a difference in cost per pupil when you look across the schools. And that's really at the heart of the challenges we're facing, is, striving for efficiencies to be able to maintain that quality of education while meeting the financial constraints that are placed upon us.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, basically what you've said is if you add one student to a school, you've lowered the per pupil cost, but you really haven't changed the quality of education. So when I hear discussion about we're going to equalize, that equity is based on per pupil cost by town, it just doesn't make any sense to me. So it's just a commentary, but thank you. I appreciate all your answers.
If I could, I will, being representing a town outside of Lincoln, that additional cost in Lincoln does get spread across the other towns to support that additional cost for that equity.
And Nancy has her hand up again.
Thanks. Just going back to the CLA, I just wanted to point out then that if all 5 of our towns had the same CLA, let's say they all were appraising their properties at 100% of what the state says they're worth, then they would all, if they all then had a CLA of 100%, they'd all have the same tax rate. And if they are less than 100%, part of the reason is there's a huge backlog of towns trying to get reappraisers to help them complete reappraisals.
I would say that's true if the town is pursuing a reappraisal and can't get it done because of the backlog. If a town's not pursuing it, then it's not due to the backlog.
Right. but but they might be pursuing it and find they'd have to wait 2 or 3 years and then they give it up.
Yep.
And Nancy's right. I mean, the CLA is not something the board has control over. It is the town piece.
If I can interject for a moment. So I think the CLA is a flashpoint that people like to talk about, and it's very difficult to understand. What it boils down to, though, in a perfect world, which of course we're not in, if you're living in a house in Lincoln that's appraised at $250,000, but really would only sell for 200, now your CLA is going to be over 100%, and your tax rates, I'm sorry, your CLA is going to be down and your tax rate's going to go up. You'll pay the same number of dollars out of your checkbook as a person in another town that's living in a house that's appraised at 250,000 that's really worth 300,000, and their CLA is going to be different in that town, but the check that they write for their school taxes will be the same if the CLA is done properly. And of course, there's been a lot of court cases over that. But that's the notion behind the CLA, is that you'll pay out of your wallet or your checkbook, you will pay the equivalent amount of money for the same house in value of a house on the market in each of our towns.
Yeah, oversimplifying it, it's just trying to get an equalized market valuation so that the taxation is equal, so that there's no incentive to a town not increasing or not going out and having it reappraised. So if there was no CLA and your house was appraised at $100,000 and taxed at $100,000, even though the market value might have it at $300,000, the town that you live in is effectively underpaying the education tax statewide as structured under the whole Brigham Act.
I think, Paul, I think your hand's still up from before, Paul, if you want to put it down, or do you have another question?
I do not, Dawn, have another question. Thank you for asking.
Sandy Lee.
And just a reminder, if people could mute if they're not speaking, I think there's some background noise because of that.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, Don. I appreciate it. I did have a question about what happened when we became a unified district to before. And I don't remember the answer to this, so that's why I'm asking. So before we became a unified district, were towns able to pay a higher tax rate by town? Like they could do something separately to support their budgets, separate from like what we have now, a unified budget?
Right. So each town would have their own. So where you see in this slide that I'm showing an adjusted homestead tax rate, each town had their own different adjusted homestead tax rate, and that was driven by largely the cost per pupil. So schools could choose, or towns, oftentimes a town school district was a school district for a single school. So you could spend more per pupil, knowing that it would increase your town's tax rate, and it only impacted your town's tax rate. And then on top of that, whatever your town's CLA was would further impact what that the homestead tax rate was to actually produce your property tax rate. Right. So it was absolutely decided town by town what was a sustainable increase to taxes.
And did that ability go away with the unification, Patrick?
Correct. So as a unified district, we are required to have a single tax rate for the district, which in reality is what it was before, right? So each district had their own tax rate. It just happened to be that each town had its own district.
Right, but they had so is there nothing out there that gives the town the ability to, on its own, if it wanted to as a town, contribute more?
No.
And there used to be, though, but there used to be.
Correct.
Oh, I think towns, individuals, towns, boards, committees can spend more money on education in their community outside of the school budget and outside of the tax rate. So an individual in Lincoln could create $1 million fund to pay for athletic equipment at the Lincoln School. And I don't think that that would affect the education spending or the tax rate in that community.
But would it change the math in terms of the cost for that school or how we look at each small school, not just Lincoln, but other schools in our district?
No, I don't think it would. So, you know, the school PTO is a good example of that, right? So our schools have PTOs. Not all of our PTOs generate the same sort of amount of dollars per student, if you want to think about it that way. If one PTO generated $1 million annually to do things and a different PTO generated $10,000 to do things, those are certainly differences in experiences and opportunities for students in those towns, but we don't factor that into the budget building process or the tax rates or anything like that.
Okay, because I kind of see this being, it's an interesting other layer in terms of when Act 46 was approved and we became unified, it diminished the ability for smaller towns and smaller schools to keep their smaller schools going while trying to be fair to all the other communities. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And just some thoughts. It just, when I heard about the different numbers, it just made me think about that. But thank you for your answers. I appreciate it.
Okay, and then it looks like Nate Richardson has his hand up. Sandy, you have to put your hand down.
Yeah, I was going to ask this question, and Dave, what you had said was really helpful, and so I guess I'm just trying to make sure that I understand this and what you were explaining. So with the CLAs, if I'm doing my math right, and I have a little Excel spreadsheet up here, based on the CLA here, like if you take a $200,000 house, for example, right now what the CLA is saying is that that house being appraised for taxes in Bristol, and it's coming out at 184.5 when you put that 92.25% against that. And then in Lincoln, that, you know, a $200,000 house is coming out appraised at $213,200 when you consider the 106.6%. So when you put the property tax rates against those for that $200,000 house, it comes out exactly the same, $3,445.35 for both Bristol and Lincoln. And so if you, in that scenario, if you had two people that purchased that $200,000 home in Bristol and then in Lincoln, they're paying the same at the end of the day. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, I believe so. So people get carried away, and influenced and emotional over those property tax rate numbers at the bottom of the page when they should be ignored. You know, the people
Right.
in equalized houses are going to be paying the same number of tax dollars out of their pockets as you figured out.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And that's really helpful. So I just, might I suggest that a scenario like that might be included in a slide like this, just to help add that really helpful context. Because I think, to your point, David, I was kind of taken aback by the differences, and then once it was explained and that scenario was drawn out, it was really helpful in understanding that I was mistaken in being taken aback by the differences. Thank you.
Thank you. Don't forget to put your hand down. Yep. Great. Thanks. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I don't see any more hands, Patrick. So I guess we can move ahead.
Okay. So when we take those new tax rates with those figures and really take a look at, so what does that actually mean for folks that pay based on the value of their home? We showed a slide that attempted to kind of portray what happens to folks who pay based on income, which is about 2/3 of Vermonters. Now looking at the other 1/3 who pay based on the value of their home, you can see from a dollars and cents perspective, per 100,000 of the assessed value, what that means for folks in those towns. And again, I think keeping Nate's example in mind, that applies here. So assuming the value of your home didn't change, right? 100,000 of that assessed value is up by 43.54 in Lincoln versus 144 in Bristol. But presumably what your home is assessed at is different. And so there is that adjustment factor to balance even these dollars and cents figures out when you apply the CLA. And I think this is the last sort of overview slide for this. So I can pause here for any questions about what we've shown so far, and then we can walk through the more detailed information that's been shared.
Patrick, this is Steve. I was just curious. I sort of understand why you're looking to put, roughly 370 into the capital reserve. I think that's to help offset the electrical and the roof costs at Mount Abe, et cetera, or to build a budget to do that. Is there any logic into putting, what would be the difference in putting that potentially into the education reserve instead of the capital reserve to try to soften this $2.3 million FY23 issue?
Yeah, I don't think which fund it goes into doesn't really impact, doesn't soften anything. The two funds have different purposes. The Education Reserve Fund is a broader fund that the board has authority to spend dollars out of. We wanted to have some money there because of the significantly moving parts and pieces of healthcare. There are plenty of other things that having some money there could help us address, if we found ourselves facing some challenges financially due to some unanticipated expenses. The Capital Reserve Fund can only be used on facilities and actually requires a vote of the electorate. Typically, it's been a vote of the electorate from the floor at a special meeting to expend those funds. Usually there's a pretty specific purpose for those. For example, we need to put a new roof on a building. So would the voters approve spending X dollars to put a new roof on a building? If we play that out differently, the Education Reserve Fund cannot be used for capital expenses. So whichever one of those we put the money into doesn't soften anything necessarily for FY22 because it's not being applied to offset taxes. That's what would soften FY22's at least tax rates.
Well, I'm curious if we had, for starters, I'm suggesting the Education Reserve Fund because one, the board has direct control over it, and one could argue that keeping more staff between years is an educational purpose for that reserve. And two, we have like a $250,000 balance in that reserve right now.
Yep.
And if we, just for argument's sake, if we put 200,000 into it in this current budget cycle, is it possible to spend that reserve against the FY23 budget?
I don't know that you could spend it against the budget, but you could spend that in that budget year, right? Like, so you could spend dollars from the education reserve fund in FY22 or in FY23 for a range of different things. And it wouldn't necessarily count against. The question becomes sustainability.
Yeah.
If what you're looking for is a one-time stopgap, I think the Ed Reserve could provide that. Otherwise, it's becomes unsustainable, right? If it's a position we really want to keep year over year, we shouldn't use the Ed Reserve Fund to do that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm just curious about the flexibility of trying to soften that FY23 issue, only in that if we don't come up with the the silver bullet between now and having to execute FY23, would it be possible to use that money to hang on to a few more staff folks, pending us coming up with a better plan?
Yeah. Another approach to a similar idea, Steve, and I don't know if this is still in line with what you're thinking. I'm not sure I'd say this is advisable, but I think it's another way to do what you're proposing, or at least contemplating. We're projecting, we're recommending here that we apply $366,000 to offset taxes. And I think that's important to note here, because that may look a little different than what we've seen before. This actually proposes that we put $600,000 in the capital reserve fund, use $366,000 to offset taxes. An approach could be to not put the $366,000 toward offsetting taxes next year, and effectively applying zero fund balance dollars to FY22 to offset taxes. Unless we cut some more money out, that would produce a higher tax rate for FY22 than what we're projecting currently. But by applying $0 to offset taxes for FY22, any dollars that we have in a fund balance from next year that we wanted to apply to FY23 would be a revenue find, right? So let's say we applied zero fund balance dollars from 21 to 22, and we apply $500,000 of fund balance from 22 to 23. We basically just bought $500,000 of spending in 23 that we didn't have in 22, and it doesn't impact the tax rate. So that's another approach to using fund balance dollars to soften FY23.
Thanks for that clarity, Patrick. I got confused with Steve's question. So we, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, we have nearly $1 million in dollars in the bank in excess of what we need to finish out this year. And you're proposing we put 600,000 in the capital reserve and nearly 400,000 to in the revenue line to reduce taxes for FY22. Almost
right. It's not $1 million for this year. It was last year.
Okay. Yeah. Right. So my question is, you have said we need $1 million worth of roof repairs and $1.5 million in electrical repairs, or vice versa.
Vice versa, I think, but yeah.
With the 600,000 put in the capital reserve fund, is there enough money then to accomplish those two tasks in FY22?
So we currently have 600,000 in the capital reserve fund. So this would put another 600,000. So that brings us up to 1.2. And then we do have $1 million in construction services in our budget. So we could tackle one and maybe almost both if we depleted that capital reserve fund, which we may want to do and we may not want to do. If we have an emergency situation that we didn't anticipate and we depleted our capital reserve fund, that can put us in a little bit of a pickle. But it's an option anyway.
So if we put the additional 366, 229 in capital reserve, we could accomplish both tasks and still have a little bit for emergencies and capital reserve.
Right. And then we would probably cross our fingers that what we actually get for costs, because these are estimates at this point, maybe come in a little lower, and that gives us that much more cushion. And there are
Okay,
plenty of
thank
other
you.
projects that are needed. Those are two big ticket projects that come to mind, but there obviously are plenty of others.
And Patrick and I have been bouncing back and forth with the capital construction bill that is sitting on a wall somewhere in the legislature. Should that come to fruition, there's great advantages to us from a education spending standpoint to identify this as capital money.
And actually what you'll see when we get into some of the more details, what has historically for several years now been $1 million in the construction services line in the general fund, we're proposing becomes 1.1 million. The reality is construction costs go up every year. So when you keep that $1 million flat, what that $1 million gets you every year is less and less than the year before. So to try and keep up with the inflation of construction, we should make that a 5% increase each year just to get the same amount of work done year over year. So you're going to see that 1.1 million to try and kind of catch up a little bit from years that we haven't put that 5% in.
Thank you.
Patrick, is the 2.5 million projected cost for the roof and the electrical, is that imminent need?
We're working to get a professional opinion, at least currently, on the roof. So we're gonna hire someone to come and really take a close look at that roof to see how imminent is that, so we can try to strategize with good information. I don't think we've initiated something similar on the electrical, but we could do that and really try to pin that down to be able to know which one comes first and how do we start to really motivate around those things.
I got a question about the construction services exclusion. That exclusion, that money would still be treated as expense money, wouldn't it? And so that would exclude us from the penalty for equalized pupil, but nonetheless, that is an expenditure, a budget expenditure. So we're not really saving anything. And it could potentially increase the budget in the sense that we could spend more money before we hit the equalized pupil limit again.
That is true. And for the purposes of calculating taxes, that those dollars, even though they don't count against our penalty, still count in the calculation toward the tax rate. We just don't get penalized.
Floyd, I think it might be you're not muted that's causing the.
Thank you.
Patrick, has there been, this expert you're going to have come look at the roof, has he or someone in the past looked at installing solar panels on the roof? And if we found a financial institution that had the tax liability roof repairs in order to hold a solar system are recoverable through the federal income tax. So it could be beneficial both to a financial institution that would own the project and lease it to the school district, and to us to reduce our costs and, by the way, make some renewable energy.
Yeah, that concept has come up, and I think we, as Floyd and I have talked some, and I think Joel as well, I think we agreed there's great advantages to utilizing that roof space. There's quite a lot of roof space there to take advantage of. And it theoretically could produce more energy than Mount Abe uses, and that energy can go into the cost of energy for other buildings, et cetera. So definitely a potential value there. There are a lot of different sort of deals to be made out there, and they all come with different pros and cons. So it starts to get complicated when you get into the details of what makes the most sense for a school district like us. So we can't take advantage of the tax incentives because we're a tax exempt entity. And I think that's kind of what you're alluding to, that maybe a contractor somehow could, and we could benefit from that somehow indirectly. And that's where it starts to get a little complicated. But though it's a great idea in a building with the needs that it has, in our lack of success in passing a bond, green energy is great. Functioning bathrooms are better. So that's sort of the approach we've been taking as we think about investing funds into the Mount Abe facility specifically.
Yeah, and on an older building like that, there's also got to be a lot of analysis on the structural loading you're putting on it. It may not have the capacity.
Yep. And a lot of our energy related efforts recently have been on the reduce consumption side of things, which is effectively as good as generating green energy. The combination, of course, is the best. Let's work on reducing energy consumption and pursue generating that energy through green energy. So we're at least working on half of that equation as we get the opportunity in a more manageable financial way.
I was just thinking if we can find a financial institution to pay for the roof repairs and install a solar system, they get the benefit of reaping all those tax incentives, and we get to protect our budget.
Yeah. The most interesting idea we had proposed was someone really wanted to put solar panels over the whole parking area at Mount Abe, sort of almost like putting a roof over the parking area and generating that, and then it gets complicated from there, from that concept, in terms of how that actually materializes and what this sort of deal was. And but there's a lot of options that are available when we get to that point of pursuing them. And I do hope it's a when. I hope it's not an if. I hope it's a when, because it makes good sense in a lot of ways.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
So when we're talking about setting aside money for these capital projects, and you're pointing out those that are needed at Mount Abe, can I assume that's because those are the most pressing that would go beyond what we have budgeted for the facilities needs of all of the buildings in our district?
Yeah, we've definitely been taking care of some of the facilities needs of the other buildings as well. The combination of the other buildings being in less need and being a fraction of the size leads to the lion's share of that money going toward Mount Abe, and in the reality that it was the Mount Abe board specifically years ago that put that money in there specifically for addressing needs at the Mount Abe facility. We're trying to kind of honor the intent of that money there. But most notably, when we made some major security upgrades in all of our schools, that money went toward those upgrades at the elementary schools as well. So we have historically been using that for needs beyond Mount Abe, but really try to target the bulk of it to Mount Abe specifically.
And then can I ask a follow-up question? So the security needs that were prioritized across all elementary schools, do we have a sense of the ADA accessibility needs across all of our elementary schools? So those needs may not be the same as a roof or electrical access, but I'm just wondering about, and maybe this isn't the time to go into the deep dive on that, but as we think about the different buildings in our district, those that are not fully accessible to all students, and how we plan for costs to ensure that they are, or even those that are accessible and that are accessible in a subpar way. I would point to the elevator at Mount Abe as being a good example.
Yeah, I think it's a fair statement that our buildings have different levels of accessibility. Absolutely. And I think I spoke to that a bit in my recommendation as to why the buildings I selected to be used were the buildings that I selected. And I know we have reports that speak to accessibility on a building by building basis, but I don't know that we have a comprehensive report that looks across all schools and sort of triages need. That may be something that would be worthwhile. I think it's a different lens than the information we have. I think that's something we could certainly look into. And some of it is like trying to part of, and Mount Abe's a good example, but it applies beyond Mount Abe. What's tricky, so we have this $1 million that we can spend at Mount Abe and even some other schools if there's need there. But when we think about Mount Abe, you know, we've attempted to secure a bond unsuccessfully a few times. And in anticipation of something someday, maybe, we're trying to be strategic in where we make change. Like, we don't want to, for example, renovate the library and spend $300,000 doing that to 4 years from now in a major construction project, have the library get moved, because that could feel like it's not money well spent. So we're trying to be strategic in what we tackle, given the need, to focus on areas that in all of the versions that we've looked at for renovations have stayed. So if you think about, we kind of started from the outside and worked in. We had a falling down sort of maintenance bus barn shed. We took care of that because that wasn't changing. We addressed the locker rooms because in all of the scenarios, the locker rooms stayed where they were. We put some money into the auditorium because the auditorium hasn't been moving. So we've been trying to be strategic there. If I extend that to the elementary school conversation, with the uncertainty about what's going to happen long-term for our elementary schools, we need to continue to operate them and we need to maintain them, and that's important. And without having that long-range plan to invest that much money into buildings that we don't know what's going to happen with, starts to get complicated a little bit too. So we're trying to be really good stewards of the money, and it's hard to do without a long-range plan.
And I think that's what I was reflecting on, is that we haven't talked as much about what we had hoped to build toward, and what we're limited in our ability to do in our current situation, and how that impacts different students' experiences.
Yeah, we do look for opportunities. So thinking of accessibility, we look for opportunities to make improvements. So we did the renovation to the sort of entrance at Mount Abe, and we put a proper curb cut in. So anything that we do, we're making improvements with an accessibility lens. And it's just that we can't quite get to everything at the rate that we wish we could.
Okay, I think we probably should move along because it's getting about 7:10.
All right, I will stop sharing. I'm going to find the detail, and I'll kind of walk through the detail, pointing out some of the things that I think are the bigger kind of eye catchers. Let me just find that. And again, I've shared this with the board, and we can make it available on the website following tonight's meeting. So folks can have a chance to dig deeper ahead of Tuesday's meeting and then ahead of the annual meeting when we get to that. So let me share this screen now. So we kept the same format that we used last year. That was really well received as we reflected on some remarks that we heard from our community the year prior. So definitely took a, if it ain't broke, don't fix it approach. So that's what you're seeing here. This is the overview page. And you can see here kind of the color-coded expenditure lines. On the pages that follow, each of those color-coded lines are broken down to a finer grain of detail. There's a lot of other detail behind the level that you'll see tonight. But this is the level of detail that seemed satisfactory last year. So that's our place to start. And you can see overall, when you look to the right, pretty modest changes in expenses, some downward, some upwards. Probably the biggest attention grabber, if I can get my cursor there, is this 10% increase in the building improvements. And that's exactly what I just spoke to, which is that making the 1.1 million to try and account for the increase in construction costs. Then down here, you can see the various revenues as well. And of course, the revenues tie into the expenditures, and that kind of gives you that balanced budget. When we start,
Patrick, if we're if you disregard the 10% we chose to put on construction, what are the other change categories average out to? Do we know?
boy, it's a good question. So if I'm looking at this just kind of quickly, if a $321,000 increase is 1%, and we change that to a 221,000, that's close to a third. That 1% increase becomes somewhere around 0.66% increase. If my logic makes sense.
Okay.
So, and I'm just realizing that as I work through the PDF here, let's see if I can turn these around. So that's going to be
Patrick, you show a debt service of $200,000 when we were looking at for Jen's finances yesterday. I forget the numbers, but I didn't see a $200,000 debt service for Mount Abe. Did I miss that?
Nope, I can explain the difference. So what you see here, and actually the 203,000, there's a default just sort of 2% increase here. That's actually going to be decreased when you see the next version of this, because our principal is going down. So the interest we pay is going down. So that's going to actually decrease some. But I can explain still the concept here. What you're seeing here is what we pay annually on principal and interest. This doesn't reflect what we carry for a balance, right? So we have a principal payment and we have an interest payment, and this is the combination of the two. So basically we pay close to $200,000 a year on a combined $1.5 million of debt.
If I remember correctly, Virgins was paying in the range of 600,000. Is that right?
Yes, I think they're actually just over 600,000 on about 10 million or 10.5 million, I think is what they're carrying.
Thank you.
And let me see, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and see if I can pull up a different electronic version of this to be a little easier on everybody's eyes, so you don't have to turn your head sideways or tip your computer or whatever you'd have to do. Give me just a minute. And actually, Floyd, I think the only thing I have was out of the copier. I think you have this electronically. Can you share it with me and I can pull it up?
We're working on it now.
Okay.
We need some elevator music or something.
We do. I almost said talk amongst yourselves, but I thought that might be dangerous. We may never come back and get this meeting going, so. Let me know when it's on its way, Floyd, so I can impatiently hit the refresh button.
Well, I hit print and we're in a computer lock. I've got a not responding to get it to you, and now I can't do anything with it. So I'm working on it. I'm sorry.
And you said you hit print, but I'm not looking for a printed version. I'm looking for an electronic.
I was printing it. I was taking it from an Excel and printing it to a PDF and sending that to you. And now I'm
locked.
Patrick, do you have a thumbnail view off to the side of that? In the one that the PDF that you have?
I'm looking.
If you right click on one of those thumbnails, it'll give you the rotate document command, and you can rotate the whole document.
Oh, there you go. Never mind. All right, we just can't look at the first page anymore because now that's sideways, but the rest of them are oriented the way we want. Thanks for that, Steve.
Nice to have a techie amongst us. Thanks, Steve.
Welcome to my world.
All right, let me share my screen again.
You actually saved us. I was looking for something entertaining, which might have been dangerous.
All right, so here we go. So this was our cover page, and now we're digging into some of those layers. So again, you'd see that kind of pinkish color at the top line, and that's the first line as we dig into the details.
Can you zoom a little bit?
Sorry, yeah. Is that okay?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. So just to kind of orient you to the detail, again, you see the header that you saw on the summary page, a little descriptor of what this is. Then you see the different lines within this category, and to the right, you see some notes that try to explain some of the more significant changes that may catch someone's attention. So direct instruction, this is really looking at all of the costs that are associated with general instruction, including teachers' salaries, insurances, other benefits. Also includes classroom supplies, equipment, textbooks, interventionists, and preschool partnerships associated with the general education. So again, what you see here is relatively modest changes in most places. You see a lower increase from a percent standpoint in salaries than you might expect. And that's a result of not filling some of the positions that were vacated. We've talked about that coming into this year. We had 9.8, I think, FTE positions that we did not fill. And so that reduces what you would see there for an increase. And of course, that has an impact on insurance and Social Security and all those other things that are related to personnel. So you do see the salary change here from not filling those positions. On the insurance side, you see a 7% increase, which again is less than we might have expected to see, given that premiums went up 10%. But with fewer people, that was mitigated to an extent. A couple of other notes around the retirement workers' comp, that's up a little bit. So again, there's sort of a trade there. Some of the people may have chosen some retirement. And there's an expense on that side of it. Let's see, professional education services, there's some intensive needs that we're expecting for students forthcoming, and that's represented there. And then the early education, that tuition to private schools, when we're looking at the direct instruction regular ed, I think if I recall, Floyd, looking at this is largely the early education dollars that come into the school system and then out to our private providers to cover the 10 hours for pre-K students.
Exactly.
And Nancy has her hand up when you get to a stopping point.
Yeah, I think that mostly addresses. There are a couple of other notes there for some small changes, but I can pause there and take a question.
Patrick, I heard that there was a bill introduced in the legislature to pull any health insurance increases out of the formula for spending per equalized pupil. Did you hear the same thing?
I've heard that. I hear a lot of things. What materializes is really what I look for.
Okay.
But yes, I have heard that. I think there is some interest. I've heard from some of our local legislators that there's an interest in looking at healthcare. One idea specifically was, if we can't really take all of healthcare out, maybe just the increases in healthcare because they're so significant each year. The question remains, so the devil's in the details, right? Great if the increase in health insurance comes off, but they lower the spending per pupil that's allowed, the net is really what impacts us, and it's hard to know what the net would be.
Yeah.
Yeah, my suggestion was actually that they raise the spending threshold. They're using the NEEP index right now, and that may be a good barometer for the general escalation in the economy. But we get directly impacted at a very detailed level by the specific increase in health insurance. And if they were to at least accommodate that on top of the NEEP index, the spending threshold would rise, to float along with whatever those numbers were.
Yeah, I don't disagree. And I think what starts to get complicated when we're talking state level changes is, I think there's some belief at the state level, perhaps a great deal of belief. I don't have a clear picture that controlling spending in Vermont to help make Vermont more affordable is a really key strategy in turning around our demographic challenge. And if that's true, changing it so that we can spend more in education to avoid penalty probably doesn't serve that interest well. So I think they're trying to balance the impact they're hearing from constituents about in terms of what's happening in local school communities with an interest in making Vermont more affordable. And those two things bump against each other a bit.
Well, investing in broadband would be a better way to turn the enrollment problem around.
Yep. All right, so if I continue on, now in the yellow here, this is direct instruction and special education. So these are the costs associated with special education, including the special educator salaries, insurances, and other benefits, and supplies, equipment, textbooks, federal, state, and local dollars that fund special education to meet the individual needs of students. So this is sort of looking at the bulk of our special education spending. And you see some greater changes here, which has historically been something that we see in the area of special education because need changes year over year. And we have a moral, ethical, and legal obligation to adjust our services to meet those needs. And it doesn't take too many students changing needs or incoming students or whatever the case may be to create pretty significant percent fluctuations in this area. But what you do see here in a few places are the reflected reduction of 5 positions. So you see a lot of those decreases there. And then of course, mitigated by the expected 10% increase in premiums. With 5 fewer positions, we're not seeing quite the 10% there. You do see some increases in purchase services, travel, communications, and tuition to private schools. And those changes are really directly based on anticipated student need for the coming year. And then in supplies, you see a pretty significant percent change. And that reflects efforts that went into kind of gearing up and retooling and rehabbing what used to be called the White House, which we then painted gray. So now it's called the Gray House, which is an alternative instructional environment for some students with some intensive needs. And we have a partnership program actually in that building. We have a student from Madison Central who has joined us there, which is great to kind of collaborate. And we partner with an outside agency to provide some of those services in-house with some of our folks. So there's been some educational opportunities with some of our folks working side by side with these kind of experts in this area. So it's been a great thing. I think we're serving students well there. Susan could go into depth on that if you were interested, but it did take some money to kind of get that up and running. And what you see here reflects wanting to keep that going.
So Patrick, the line tuition to private schools, is that reimbursed at the 95% rate? And then the rest of them, are they reimbursed at a different rate?
Yeah, it's not exactly that clean. Like that whole line wouldn't be reimbursed at 95%. So let's say in that line, there's a student whose cost for their needs being met is 100,000. The first 60,000 of that 100,000 is reimbursed at the 54% rate, and the other 40,000 is reimbursed at 95%.
Right.
So it isn't super clear in taking that total figure and calculating what that amounts to in a reimbursement, but that's kind of how it works. And likewise, in some of the other places where you see some purchase services, in there could be some expenses that exceed 60,000 and would trigger the 95% reimbursement rate.
Right. So the rest of them are at the 54% rate.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Basically,
there's a year lag in that, right?
Yeah, and that's why when we're showing revenue for special education, it's a projected revenue. Really, that revenue evolves over time, right? So there may be a student whose needs, incur a cost of $200,000. That student may move out of district, and we no longer have that expense, and we no longer get the revenue because we're not incurring that expense. So that changes our expenditure at the end of the year and the revenue we would get at the end of the year. Likewise, we could have a student move in whose needs require $200,000 of support, and we didn't budget for it, but they move in and we have to account for that. And there's going to be an expense side, and there's going to be revenue that we hadn't anticipated as well. So that's that's one of the hard parts in special education, is we can't always be right on top of things as we'd like to, because it's not unheard of that we may have, and Susan could confer, 3 or 4 high need students move in that we didn't know were going to be moving in, and we just sort of adjust.
Is that what the Education Reserve Fund can be used for?
Right. So if those needs that were unexpected come in, and that's going to put us in a place where we were concerned about either deficit spending, or we were concerned about what it would leave for a fund balance, given what we were trying to do going forward, that there's some flexibility there in using that education reserve to help kind of piece things together.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The next line, or the next category, is substitutes. What you'll see here, so you see a 0% increase. I think the story here could be, as you look at the actuals from FY20, they're low, but we need to remember that somewhere around a quarter of FY20 was all remote learning. So I think our proposal is that we keep what we had budgeted flat for substitutes, because we can't lean on what we experience in FY20 going forward. Then we'll move into the vocational education. This is something we reflect in our budgets, but in reality is set by someone else, and it basically gets placed in our budget to produce the taxes needed to generate the funds to support the tech center. But you can see our tuition is expected to go down based on a combination of the cost per pupil and the number of pupils that we'll be sending, and a slight uptick in the on behalf of the transfer. So we're expecting to have to pay a little bit more there. And this is where you may recall some time ago, a few months ago now probably, we heard from the Career Center director, and this is where, when we were hearing his budget presentation, this is where we see the impact of their budget.
What's it mean? What's it
Patrick,
mean?
have you been able to update that with his latest?
I'd have to turn it over to Floyd to see. I suspect this reflects the most recent. I know there's been much better communication this year between the Career Center and local school districts. So I'm leaning on that knowledge to believe that this is the most updated, but I'll turn that to Floyd to confirm.
We're pretty confident with these numbers. The new financial person over at Hannaford has been very proactive, has gotten information to us, and has given it a couple of changes along the way. This number is, we think it's as spot on as they can get it. We're not anticipating a change.
Yeah, I was just curious because I'm
Yeah,
on,
let's not bring that
I'm on
up.
that board now, so I know they've updated the number a couple times, and I just wanted to check it.
Yeah, we're good.
What's the on behalf transfer by state? What's that mean?
That's a money in, money out. We're being reimbursed that amount by the state to help cover some of this cost, but we have to track it as an expense because we're writing the check to Hannaford or a little bit to Essex and a little bit to Burlington. And those are the two pieces, and that's the way the state breaks it out, and we reflect that in that way here.
And so there's a revenue that matches that on the revenue side of this.
The 329 will be matched with a revenue of 329.
Yes. So looking at athletics and co-curricular, so our proposal keeps that flat. Again, I think we can't really reliably look at FY20 actuals to make projections here because the spring season effectively didn't happen. So those expenses are going to be lower than what we might anticipate otherwise. Student support services. So now this is looking at school-based clinician services included in here. But we see that some different positions, attendance and social work, et cetera. And again, a lot of these have to do with changes in personnel, the health insurance premiums, anticipated need. That's really the story behind any of the changes that are here in these different categories. But I'm happy to try and answer any specific questions, and Susan's here to try and help as well. All right, hearing none, we'll keep moving on to professional development. So this is in-service training and development, conference fees, teacher mentor stipends. It's also the salaries, benefits, travel, supplies, et cetera, for the math coaches, literacy coaches, SEL learning coaches. And a lot of what you see here are due to, again, some staffing changes. We did change some of the stipends. So we're seeing less need for the stipends. I think in part because of the work that our coaches and interventionists, in particular coaches and coordinators probably are doing. Katrina can speak more in depth to that, but that's what you're seeing reflected here.
Mount Abe changed their teacher leader structure. So it's a little bit more condensed and a little bit more focused on teacher leadership as it relates to curriculum instruction and assessment as well, and a little bit less around what we might think of as a traditional department chair or department head. And that's what's reflected where it says 10 less teacher stipends needed. And then the one less FTE was last year we had a literacy coach position open that we chose not to fill.
Nancy? Oh, you're muted, Nancy. Sorry.
What's the total FTEs for the coaches in all three areas?
We have 3 literacy coaches, 4 math coaches, and 3 social emotional learning coaches for the 6 schools. That's what's reflected in this portion of the budget. We also have a 0.5 proficiency-based learning coach in a different part of the budget. And we have 1 FTE special education coach also in a different part of the budget.
Thanks.
All right, next up is media services. So almost exclusively librarians here collectively across the district. We did have a reduction in FTEs in library media, and those staffing changes reflect the salaries, insurance, Social Security that you see there. And then there is an uptick by a little under $500 in retirement. And that's a small number, so almost $500 produces a 9% change, which can be an attention grabber. That one's pretty straightforward. So pause for a moment to see if there are questions here. Okay, general administration. So board stipends, printing, advertising, travel and supplies. This is also where the HRA expense is shown. Workers' compensation as well. Salaries and benefits for the superintendent, assistant superintendent, administrative assistants at the central office. That's what's captured here. So when we look at the professional service workers, that's all down because of the lower projected utility of the HRA. We were concerned in building the budget we're in now about the change happening that took place July 1. We were anticipating our prior coverage. The district was picking up more of the back end costs of that. The new coverage, which started July 1, the district picks up the front end. So the concern this year was we incur our greatest cost in the former plans on the back end and the greatest cost of the new plans on the front end, and that was going to be in the same fiscal year for us. So we budgeted to be able to withstand what we were projecting. We don't have to budget that way because that's not going to be true for next year. So you see a reduction there in what we're budgeting for HRA expenses as a result.
And Patrick, we won't know the true FY21 picture for quite some time, right?
It'll be partway through next fiscal year before we have that. It'll need to be audited and all of that. So yes, it will be quite some time before we really know.
All right.
So again, no major changes here. Happy to answer any questions. All right, now we're looking at school administration. So this is building level administrators and administrative assistants, non-capital equipment, postage and travel. And we see a decrease here in administrator salaries. That's a result of reducing one, actually I think it was a 0.8 or 0.9 FTE assistant principal position at Mount Abe. We had some staffing changes in the clerical realm, so that's what reflects those the decrease there. Again, we see the insurance change is pretty close to what was expected, and the Social Security and the retirement again are a result of some of those staffing changes. Questions here? All right, other administration. So this is special education administration and the ELP. The ELP position was 79% grant funded in prior years, and now is fully funded in the locally in the current year. So there's a requirement, I believe, Katrina can speak to it more, from our 21C grant, which is really what helped get ELP off the ground, that we make efforts to make the programming more sustainable within our general fund. So some of what you see here reflects efforts to do that. And the change in the special ed administration is directly related to some unbudgeted FY21 Easy Track Medicaid software. And Floyd can speak a little bit more to that if there's a question around it. So central services, this is finance department, technology department. There's some long and short-term borrowing in here. And you'll notice there's a $25,000 amount that's sustained in this to continue with some software conversion work. Right now, we are among the later groups to be working on a conversion to e-finance, which is a new finance system. It has not gone well, I don't think, anywhere. We're not anticipating it going very well for us. Unfortunately, what I think some districts are needing to do, so moving to eFinance Plus is a requirement at the state level. And yet, I think from what I'm hearing, and Floyd can confirm, there are state level reports we have to generate that cannot be generated in eFinance Plus. So what I'm hearing other districts are doing, they're continuing to pay for their Infinite Vision software, which a lot of districts currently use, while also paying for the eFinance Plus software to be able to be compliant with the requests in the format in which we have to submit information to the state. So there's a capacity concern from a staffing perspective for the duplicate work. And of course, there's a cost perspective to having to operate two different softwares. And so that $25,000 is an attempt to account for what we might expect in that area.
There's an additional audit issue. One of the consistent complaints with my cohorts is that they're not able to produce a bank reconciliation report out of eFinance that will pass an audit. So we're kind of stuck having to be able to hold a software that will pass a simple bank reconciliation audit. There's a little frustration in my voice. I apologize.
Some other pieces of note here. So in the salaries line, you see a decrease in salaries despite an increase in an individual's salary. That reflects a reduction of 0.8 FTE accountant. We had an accountant leave, and we chose to fill that at 0.2. It was a 1.0 position. We filled it at 0.2. And so that's reflected there. And that has an impact again on insurance and Social Security and those other pieces as well. Happy to entertain any questions here. All right, looking at facilities. So there is an increase in salaries here, a little bit larger than the 3% that we might expect. And that's because we changed a couple of positions to pay a higher rate, but secure licensed folks. So we have a licensed electrician. We're very close to having a licensed plumber, so that we have to, and actually we have a carpenter as well. So we have to subcontract out less. So what I think is important to point out, where you see an increase in the regular salaries, that's greater than the 3% we might be expecting to see. When you look at repair and maintenance, we could decrease by a little over $25,000 because of the reduction in subcontracting. So if you took that $25,000 out of the $45,000 increase, that 5.66% comes down actually a fair bit less than 3%. And this helps us get some really high quality employees that do their electrical or carpentry or plumbing work really well and are skilled and can contribute in a lot of other really valuable ways. So it seems to have been working out really well so far. It's still relatively early, but we're feeling pretty optimistic about the direction we're going in facilities, in particular repairs and maintenance. So you see some other factors related to staffing changes. And then we made some other adjustments that reflect what we were seeing in some of the actuals. And we actually had an interesting situation at Robinson where the Robinson solar array was producing more energy than what Robinson could use. So we were leaving credits on the table and being penalized, I believe, for leaving credits on the table. And so Floyd has kind of tracked that down and worked with the company to say, you know, hey, we're a unified district. Any overproduction at the Robinson Solar site can be applied to other consumption in buildings in MAUSD. And so that reflects a change in what we're going to experience from an expense side on electricity.
Patrick, under which of these categories is the lease for central office carried?
Might look to Floyd for that. I think we would be past whichever one it's in. Would that be central services, Floyd?
It would.
I thought I saw it in last year's budget under building rental or something.
Hold on.
Just trying to scan and see.
Give me a minute on that one, Steve.
Yeah,
no problem.
We'll come back to that. Anything else on facilities before we move on? All right, transportation. So again, we have a multi-year contract with Betcha. So what you see here reflects what the contract shows. And then for some of the other things that are not contracted, you see a sort of standard 2% increase just to sort of keep up with the rate of inflation. And again, I think looking at the extra and co-curricular for FY20, there are a lot of spring trips that typically happen that did not happen last spring for obvious reasons. So again, we're not looking at those FY20 actuals to try and help project future spending. So we decided probably letting what we had budgeted go up by that typical inflationary rate was as good a strategy as any to ensure that there are funds there to enable those traditions and those experiences to continue to happen. Building improvements, we talked about the 1.1 million moving up from 1.0 million and why that is. And then debt service, we talked a little bit about as well. And that's something that will be adjusted for the next version of this document that you see. All right, Floyd, looking at your face, it doesn't look like we bought you enough time.
While we're waiting for Floyd, so my understanding is that this is just sort of an informational document. We're going to vote on a total budget, and all the line items could change over time. Could decide to have one fewer central office person or two more sped people, and all these things are movable over time. And then in the end of the year, we'll get another, or next year, we'll get another document that looks similar to this that will show what was budgeted. It'll show what was budgeted, but it might, like this shows actual FY20, it might show actual FY21, for example.
Correct. Yeah, and that is the important piece, is it's the reality is, and again, each of these lines that you see here has a whole host of lines that feed up to this level of detail. And the reality is those lines do change. I would say, I would come close to saying nearly all of those lines end up being different at the end than they are when we're building this budget, because there are so many moving parts and we're so many months ahead of the budget we're building. So what we track very carefully are when we're overspending on one line, we move that money from a different line so that we're paying close attention to the bottom dollar so that we're staying within the total dollars that were budgeted. And that's just sort of the nature of sort of managing a system as complex as a school system, and making it all happen some way or another.
Patrick, do you guys have a general feel on how well you've sort of thrown the dart at the center of the board on a year-to-year basis? Sort of looking at the budget versus the actual over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, so what we do, what you can't see in here, and what we do some in the back of the house, is looking at in a year. So for example, if we look at FY19, what did we budget in 19 and what did we spend in 19, and how did that compare? If we see that we're routinely overspending in one area and underspending in another, we might make an adjustment to those lines as we're building a budget for the future. I think in the interest of simplicity, because these documents can get pretty overwhelming, we haven't included the budgeted and the actual for those years. And we've gone back and forth a bit on whether we should or shouldn't do that. In some ways, it's helpful to share with the board and with the community, here's what we budgeted in 19, and here's what we spent in 19. Here's what we budgeted in 20, and here's what we spent in 20. But it does add more lines to a page already filled with a lot of numbers. So
yeah, I'm sort of asking more just generally and at the very top level, not at a microscopic level.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, so we have been, if I think historically, at least in the years that I've been here, we've run fund balances usually in somewhere between 500,000 and $1 million, on a $30 million budget. I think that's reasonable. Ideally, you get to a place where you don't have any fund balance to carry forward, and you spend the money that you have budgeted, and then you've really dialed it in. What's complicated, and we talked about this some earlier with special education expenses specifically, but it applies to others. There are certain things that may happen that can really cause some issues in your budgeting if you didn't have some money anticipating it. A good example might be there are some students who have significant need that we struggle to meet, who are not on an IEP and might need an out-of-district placement to have their needs met. So that $200,000 cost that gets reimbursed at a generous rate in special education isn't reimbursed at all if the student's not on an IEP. So if that need arises and we need to meet that need, we feel it's important to have funds to be able to do that. And sometimes, perhaps oftentimes, that need doesn't present. And so the money we budgeted for that goes toward the fund balance. So when you factor in things like that, to be within 500,000 or even pushing $1 million, to me is reasonable. I don't know necessarily how that compares to other districts. I think when I hear from other superintendents, I think our fund balance is comparable to what others experience, and perhaps sometimes on the lower side from what others experience, which to me says, that we're about where we should be in terms of our projections and what our actuals are. And occasionally we'll have a year that's an anomaly, whether it's an anomaly on the low side or an anomaly on the high side. And I think that's the nature of the beast as well. The key is, and this, when we start getting down to the nitty gritty as we're approaching now in this school year, understanding where we're projecting our fund balance to be relative to the fund balance we applied to offset taxes becomes really important, because that influences that next year. And above all else, I want to make sure that the district is not disadvantaged by not having enough fund balance to at least match what was put in to offset taxes the year before, because that makes difficult budgets more difficult. And we've been able to do that successfully for a few years now. And we've been strategic in putting some of that money into these reserve funds that can help ensure that we can continue to do that in the future. So all that to say, I think we do a pretty good job, and I think we are positioned to continue doing a good job in future years with what we've done with the reserve accounts.
Thanks. I actually understood all that. I just thought
all right,
it would be good for you to, I thought it would be good for you to say that.
How much of the fund balance did we use last year?
505.
So we're down, if we use 366, we're down 150 or something.
Yep.
We're moving in the right direction, yeah.
And that's strategic, Dave. That's in years when you can put less fund balance toward offsetting taxes than the year prior. That's a good strategy from my perspective, because you're that much better positioned the next year to be able to sustain it.
I agree.
The added benefit is when we can do that and still generate reasonable tax rates, it allows us to grow those reserve funds to tackle needs or be prepared for some unexpected expenses down the road.
I think it's important to note that some of our fund balance is intentional in that once our year starts, we're putting a budget together today. You guys are working on approving that budget tonight, and it starts July 1st. And such a large part of it is staffing. And we've been intentional with every teammate who leaves, really evaluating those positions. So they're thinking years out on how best we can manage our budget to meet the challenges that are coming. So there's that piece on the budget side as well, that it's not just a miss, it's a conscious effort not to replace a teammate when we have that opportunity. The accountant here in our office is a great example of that.
And to put that in context, when we think about, so a $966,000 fund balance, I'd have to look at the number of positions we didn't fill last year. But when you take out the salaries for the positions we didn't fill, that 966,000 probably pretty quickly comes down to right at that $500,000 mark or under. That reflects the fund balance that we applied the prior year. So I think that's a good point, Floyd, and that only, I think, strengthens the fact that we're pretty tight, I think, in terms of expenditures and projected. And I see Liz's hand and then Nancy, I think. And if there are others, I can't see you, so sorry.
Can I just answer Steve's question?
Yes.
It's under facilities, under rental of equipment is where we capture the central office building rental.
So in this line, okay.
Yes.
So it's part of the 133,777 that is budgeted.
That's correct.
And how much is it, Floyd? Do you have that in front of you?
I do. It's 70. Well, I did. Hold on. Give me 1 second. It is projected next year to be 71,625 with the triple net piece.
I think that in last year's version of this, that was actually its own line item. Because that's the number that I recall seeing.
I'll take a look. Yeah.
We can break that out, Steve, if that's helpful. Make another line there, I think.
No, I just think in terms of your overall plan to move to Beaman, it's tough to ferret that number out.
Sure.
Yeah, I would appreciate if that were pulled out. This is Sarah.
Yep. All right, Liz, sorry for the pause on getting to your question.
Oh, it's good. I guess since we talked a lot about special education funding and understanding that really well, a connection comes to mind for me about how a school having a nurse could, I think about how it when you're looking at positions and considering all of those things so closely and what we need and don't need, how a nurse might mitigate some special educate, like I guess put a school in a better position to take incoming and outgoing students with needs, and how that costs relative to some of these others, much in the way of tuitioning out and all the money goes to the other school versus being in your own school. I just feel like a nurse is a part of that conversation as well.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think a nurse plays a key role. And when I think about when the nurse isn't present and the student has need, someone's filling that role. We have nurse delegates, oftentimes a building principal or the admin assistant is who fills that need. So I completely agree with the importance of nurses. And then it gets tricky because if FTEs are somewhat fixed, if we add FTEs to nurses, those FTEs come from somewhere else, and then we play the trade-off game, and it becomes really hard to know what's the right decision.
Thank you.
Yeah. Nancy?
I wonder if you can just go back to the revenue page for a bit. Uh-oh.
That's all right. I think I can do this now. Thanks to Steve. There we go.
And is there an expansion of that as well?
Not in this, there isn't.
Okay.
I can let Floyd talk about details that are behind this because there are certainly details, but for this, we really only parsed out the expenditure side. Did you have a specific question, Nancy, that we can try to answer?
I'm just looking for what's familiar, but it's okay. Thank you.
All right, unless there are other questions, that is what we have to share tonight around the budget.
Okay. So board members are going to have the time, they received this document today, and they will have time to look at it over the weekend and prepare for a deeper discussion at our regular meeting on Tuesday, where we have to make the decision to adopt it and prepare the warning on Tuesday.
And again, we may get some new figures between now and Tuesday that change this slightly. I don't know that there'll be anything significant. Probably the most significant thing we're anticipating is hopefully a correction in our number of equalized pupils. But otherwise, I think they would be relatively minor changes. Floyd, let me know, is that that's your thinking too?
Certainly not hoping for any big surprises. I think that's the one that we planned for the worst case scenario with the equalized pupil. If it gets better, then we'll react that way. But I don't anticipate a lot of changes.
Yeah, we don't like surprises in late January when we're building budgets. All right, let me stop sharing.
Okay. So now we'll move down to discussion around the changes to the voting regulations. And we have an action item to determine the date for annual meeting. And our current date is 2/23/21, and the recommendation is that we stick with that day. So we just need a motion.
Don, is it worth having a bit of a brief, broader discussion about why we're seeing these changes that are unusual?
Yeah, we sort
Many
of
folks
touched
may know,
on it
others
in
may
a
not.
past meeting about the changes, but definitely go ahead.
Yeah, so just with the passage of H48, there are municipalities have some latitude in figuring out how to kind of navigate this tricky election and voting season that's upon us in light of COVID-19. So the actions you see here are necessary. Like it's necessary for the board to make decisions now so that we know what direction we're working toward regarding the way in which we vote. So some of the options are municipalities can choose to move their annual meeting. You can choose to move the vote when the vote by Australian ballots would happen. You can choose to, instead of voting from the floor on certain articles, you can move those articles to Australian ballot. We have options to determine using a tabulator or not. Do we mail the ballots to everyone or not mail the ballots to everyone? So there are a series of decisions that this municipality has to decide on so that we know what direction we're going in. And that's what this is, an attempt to kind of help walk the board through those series of decisions that then get Jennifer and I going in a particular direction to prepare for the budget vote. We're going to also, assuming this goes forward, there's a recommendation to put money into the capital reserve. So that requires an article, etc. So in the packet that I shared with you tonight also was a draft warning, a draft ballot, and a draft maybe that's it, draft warning, draft ballot related to this. Those do make some assumptions about how these actions go, but of course we can adjust those drafts pending the decisions you make. But that's sort of the big picture behind what's happening tonight.
I'm hearing a little bit of like fuzz echo. I'm wondering.
That's Floyd again.
Floyd, yeah, can you mute? Okay, thank you.
I think every time you hit your space bar, Floyd, it flips it off again.
Okay, so.
Liz still has her hand up.
Oh, yep, now she's gone. Oh. I think it's from before. Yep. Okay. So as I mentioned, the action item is to determine the date for annual meeting. Currently, it's scheduled 2/23/21.
I make a motion to keep the annual meeting date for February 23rd, 21.
I second that, Sarah McLean.
Okay. Any further discussion? Okay, no discussion. All right, I have my tabulating sheets. All right, so all those in favor of determining the meeting date, the date for the annual meeting to be 2/23/21. I'll go through the list and you can let me know. Krista.
Approve.
Sarah McLean.
Approve.
Kristen's absent. Rob.
Approve.
Dave Sharp.
Yes.
Okay. Kevin.
Yes.
Steve.
Yes.
Caleb.
Yes.
Andrew.
Yes.
Liz.
Yes.
Sarah LaPearl.
Yes.
Okay, and Annie's absent, so the motion carries. So that was.
Am I presuming this is being done by Zoom or in person?
It is being done by Zoom, I believe. Is that correct?
Right, so that's yes, that is correct. And I would say it's a tentative correct. Because and this relates to another one of the action items, you cannot vote from the floor via Zoom. Voting from the floor can only happen if it's in person. So depending on how a different action item goes, if the board wants to continue to hold some of these articles as a vote from the floor, I think what some other municipalities are doing is looking for a later date for the annual meeting in the spring, when hopefully either the conditions are better with the case counts, or distancing things are changed, or group sizes have changed, or the weather's better and you can be outside. If the intent is to move all of the current articles that have historically been a floor vote to an Australian ballot, I think keeping the date the same is a good way to go. And then it can be by Zoom because it becomes primarily an informational meeting.
All right. Then the next item was added at the beginning of the meeting, and it was to an action item to move the deadline for the consent of candidate forms to 2/1/21 as allowed by H48. And that applies to the people that usually are voted on the floor, if I understand it correctly, at the annual meeting. So that would be our moderator, our treasurer, and our clerk that we vote when we have the floor vote. So that would just change the date for them to notify that they want, to be a candidate for one of those positions.
So moved.
All right, Krista?
Second, Sarah.
Okay. Any discussion?
The one piece that I might mention is I think we have 5 board members whose term expire this year. So I believe this same approach applies. So you no longer need to get a petition with signatures. This consent of candidate form, I think, is the only thing you need. The decision you're making tonight does not impact school board seats. That's through the town. So each town select board, I think, has to decide if they're going to change this deadline or not. So you'll want to pay attention if you plan on running for your seat, if it's up, to what your town's deadline is, and then get these consent forms and fill them out. Jennifer can help connect you to the consent form if you need someone to help you kind of navigate that. But just wanted to clarify that this is specifically for the positions that Don referenced: clerk, treasurer, and moderator.
Okay. All right, you ready to vote? Krista?
I approve.
Okay. Sarah McLean?
Approve.
Kristen's absent. Rob?
Approve.
Dave Sharp?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Steve?
Yes.
Caleb?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Liz?
Yes.
Sarah?
Yes.
Okay, motion carries. All right. The next action item is to determine the method for voting articles that we typically vote on the floor at the annual meeting. The option is to move all those to our Australian ballot.
I'll make the motion.
All right, Steve. Is there a second?
A second.
Krista. Any discussion?
And I can just offer clarity as you're contemplating which way to vote on this. It has to be kind of all or nothing. If you decide that you can't pick and choose which articles that have historically been voted from the floor to move those to Australian ballot. Either all of the ones we've historically voted from the floor stay voted from the floor, or they all as a slate get voted from by Australian ballot.
Looks like Sarah LaPearl has her hand up.
Is this an Australian ballot that takes place on town meeting day or on the 20 whatever we just said?
It would be on town meeting day. So it would be the same. So our budget, putting money in the capital reserve fund, and these other articles would be on the same ballot.
So like what we pay the treasurer and what we pay the everybody. Okay.
And so if you look at the draft the draft ballot that I shared, or the sample ballot, historically what has happened is there's someone nominates someone and you go through that voting process, but then in determining the salaries, someone makes a motion a particular dollar amount. Oftentimes it starts with whatever they were getting before, or someone might think they need a raise, or someone might think they're getting too paid or overpaid. That back and forth kind of projecting of what the salary should be obviously can't happen through Australian ballot. So the approach that we're thinking currently makes the most sense is to put it on there as a discrete yes or no. Do you support the moderator getting $50? Because that's what they got last year. So we just use the same salary that was determined at the last annual meeting to say yes or no to on the Australian ballot.
So the meeting that we would normally do this at is on the 23rd. The ballot's going out on town meeting day, which is, I mean, the Australian ballot happens on the 2nd of March. So how do we get a vote on a moderator for a meeting that happened before the vote?
I think the language in the article from last year says until another one is elected. And I think that's so she remains our moderator until the next, and then gets elected for the next year.
And if it's an informational meeting and there aren't articles to be voted on, the presence of a moderator is very different in terms of need.
All right, so these votes are basically just to take care of next year's meeting.
And then Rob has his hand up.
So I was just looking at the document real quick. So this would be a vote on the school budget. Am I correct in saying that? Like the little extra slip of paper that we'd usually have when I go to town meeting? Okay, and this is going to be an in-person vote?
So that's another agenda item coming up. What we're hearing most towns are doing, I think actually all 5 of our towns, is anyone who requests a mail-in ballot is being sent a mail-in ballot, and town clerks are very agreeable to working with us to send our ballot with their ballots to those who request it. So for some it would be mail-in, but upon request, otherwise it would be in person, following the rules and regulations that are in place that will be enforced by town clerks.
Yeah, I'd just love for us to find that synergy and make sure that our voters sort of understand this. And that's not all on our shoulders, but that we do the best job so that folks feel comfortable and safe casting their up or down vote on these articles. So that we're thoughtful of that.
So by in person, Patrick, by in person, you mean they're going to go to the polls and fill out the sample ballot and store it in a box to be taken to Holly Hall, and all of the votes from all of the towns will be put through the tabulator on the evening of the 2nd. Do I understand that correctly?
Correct.
And then did you talk to other town clerks in putting this together? And this is, I think it's great that we're getting out there a lead, but it would be really good if we actually talked to them and got some collaboration with them.
Yeah, everything you see here tonight has moved forward as a result of those conversations. So we've been in close conversation with all 5 town clerks, understanding, because they didn't necessarily have to all end up doing the same thing, which really would put us in a difficult spot. Thankfully, they are. So our ability to dovetail with their processes, for exactly Rob's point, so that the voters' end feels seamless, has worked out really well, including the use of the tabulator. The town of Bristol is letting us borrow their tabulator. We're just getting our own chip to program the tabulator so that it commingles and does the things that we need it to do specific to our ballot. So lots and lots of good sort of positive relationship work there to have this be as seamless as possible for our community. So all these actions are consistent with that collaboration.
So what, Madam Chair, what decision are we making right now?
Right now, we're considering the taking the things that used to be floor votes at the annual meeting and placing them on the ballot.
Thank you.
Kevin?
Patrick, you had said something about rules and regulations or requirements or something for in-person voting. Were you referring to COVID protocols, or is there something else?
No, COVID protocols in terms of gathering sizes and distancing and all those things. And that's an important factor as we consider annual meeting and whether we move everything to the Australian ballot, because there are restrictions on group sizes and use of space. And despite that, you cannot restrict the number of people who attend in person to your annual meeting. So if you wanted to hold an annual meeting in person and wanted to take a gamble that the number of people that show up would fit in whatever space you secured, you could do that, but you can't turn people away at the door because you hit your maximum number. So I think that's part of the justification for, though different than what we've normally done, putting things on Australian ballot is a way to not have to take that gamble. Because I don't know what you do if you have more people show up than you can have, and now your annual meeting is in jeopardy.
But as far as the polling location, is there additional concerns? I mean, last November, they had everybody 6 feet apart in masks and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so that's
anything different?
Nope, I think it's going to be the same expectation. And I think luckily, the boards of civil authority have done it before, and they kind of have a system in place that I think they're going to employ for this next round of voting as well.
Okay.
It may mean longer lines because we're limited in how many people can be in there and all of that stuff. So there's certainly not no impact, but I feel like they are prepared for whatever the impact might be.
Krista?
Yeah, to Rob's point, I was just wondering if we know when folks need to request a mail-in ballot, and so we can maybe try to do some communication beforehand to explain our piece of that.
Yeah, I think I don't have the details of that. And I think we probably want to be, so in years past, when someone in a town has requested a mail-in ballot, I think it has been common practice for the town clerk to include the school ballot with the town ballots in that mailing. So in that way, what's going to happen this year is pretty consistent with what has happened. So I want to be careful about that our communication doesn't confuse people. Like if people think they have to request something separate from us to get it in the mail.
Yeah, no, I guess I was just wondering, like, when is the deadline to request a mail-in ballot? So that if we want to let folks know that you'll also be getting the school piece, and here's what that will include, to make sure that we can, when people are in the mode of requesting, that we can send something out around that time.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I can have Jennifer reach out and try to find out what that deadline is. I'm sure the town clerks know it off the top of their head.
So we're not voting on that now. That's a separate discussion, I presume, because I would like to have a discussion around mailing the ballot to everybody.
That is another action item.
That is another action item later. Okay.
Does anybody need to see the sample ballot? I mean, I was able to find it and look it over, but has everybody been able to see it?
It looks a lot like the sort of tabulator format that you're used to seeing for other votes on town meeting day. Just so that obviously the tabulator can read it and all.
Liz, did you have your hand up?
I was just thumbs upping that I got to see it.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Can I ask a quick question?
You still have your hand up.
Sure.
Oh, just out of curiosity, what's the consequence if they get, like, some of those little articles are voted down, since they're, most of the time we've had a couple issues, but we had them voted up? Like, what's the process after the fact for those? We have to go back to the whole electorate with another mail-in ballot for, like, paying a treasurer $50 or whatever it is.
I'd have to double check. My sense is if something was voted down and you effectively didn't have something, either it might default to the prior year, or you could hold a special meeting and do a floor vote, or you could hold a special meeting and do a ballot election to get a different amount approved. But there are steps that could be taken to get something approved in some way. The trick becomes really, the trickiest thing is if they say no, what is it they want? More or less, and what's the right number?
Okay, any other questions about the floor vote to Australian ballot action? Okay, so we're going to determine the method or the moving the floor votes to Australian ballot. Krista? In favor? Sarah?
Yes.
Okay. Kristen. Rob?
Yes.
Dave?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Steve?
Yes.
Caleb?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Liz?
Yes.
Sarah?
Yes.
Okay, the motion carries. All right. The next action item is to determine the date for the Australian ballot voting. And the recommendation is to keep it at March 22nd, or sorry, March 2nd as originally planned. And that, as Patrick said earlier, this is consistent with what the towns are doing.
So moved.
That's Steve. Yep.
Second, Sarah McLean.
Okay. All right. Any discussion? Any information you need? Okay. Krista, in the matter of the setting the date for the Australian ballot voting to March 2nd, how do you vote?
Approve.
Okay. Sarah McLean?
Approve.
Rob?
Yes.
Dave?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Steve?
Yes.
Caleb?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Liz?
Yes.
Sarah LaPearl?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion carries. Okay. The next item is an action item to take action to commingle the results of all articles on the Australian ballot.
I'm a little curious why we need to have a motion for that.
I think our language is around commingling our budget votes is what I think, and that because these used to be floor votes, that now we have to take the action to commingle them as Australian ballot votes.
And to your point, Steve, it might not be necessary, but it's unclear enough that to vote to be sure that that's what the board wants to do, I think eliminates any question.
Fair enough.
Are we not required to commingle the budget votes?
That we are required to commingle the budget votes. That's written in the Articles of Agreement, but depending on how you interpret some of those Articles of Agreement, it's unclear if it speaks to votes that have historically happened from the floor. I think an argument could be made that it's assumed that the commingling happens based on the Articles of Agreement, and an argument could be made that it's not that clear. This vote affirms that and takes away any question that that's what the board wants to do with those results.
So this doesn't have anything to do with the whole discussion that we had last night about Attorney Mube and what articles might or might not need to be commingled. Is that correct?
Yeah, I see them as unrelated. And there's a logistical piece to this as well. We would need to have two ballots if some of the votes on a ballot were to be commingled and other votes weren't, at least as I understand it. So this enables us to keep it all on one ballot as well.
I'll move that one too.
All right, Steve,
I'll second.
and no, it looks like we'll give it to Andrew this time. All right, any more discussion? The matter of commingling the results of all votes by Australian ballot. Krista, how do you vote?
Approve.
Sarah?
Approve.
Rob?
Sorry about that. I'm just going to abstain from this one.
Okay. Dave?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Steve?
Yeah.
Caleb?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Liz? And then Sarah LaPearl.
Yes.
Okay, so that one passed. Okay, the next item is to authorize the use of a voting tabulator.
So moved.
All right,
Second.
Krista and Caleb. Any discussion or questions?
So essentially the alternative is someone has to count them by hand.
Right, which
The alternative is multiple someone's probably have to count them by hand, and that's what we're trying to avoid. And the alternative is multiple someone's have to this is commingling in paper copy, right? Like they're in a pile and you're mashing them up and then counting them out. So this is an attempt to be more efficient with time, but also require less people in close contact and handling papers and all those sorts of things. And depending on how it goes, this may be something we want to continue to do in the future, but for now, it's at least from a safety perspective.
Just the word commingle seems inappropriate in a pandemic. Although it could be really fun to all get together and commingle. I mean, we haven't done a whole lot of that in a while, but.
all right. All those, and let's see, we're going to go down the list for the use of the voting tabulator. Krista?
Yeah, I approve.
Okay, Sarah?
Yes.
And Krista's not here. Rob?
Yes.
Dave?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Steve?
Yes.
Caleb?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Liz?
Yes.
Okay, and Sarah?
Yes. I like this easy vote.
All right, that one passed as well. Okay. And the next action item is to decide whether or not to mail ballots to all registered voters. The recommendation was to mail ballots to those who request it, and this is consistent with what the 5 towns are doing. And the towns are, as Patrick said earlier, the town clerks have said they are willing to mail our ballots with the town ballots upon request.
And we're willing to help contribute funds toward that. Just knowing there's potential for added costs to put another piece of paper in the mail or things like that. So we'll work with towns in any way that we need to help that happen, but they're very accommodating in doing so.
Don,
I move.
Go ahead. Yeah, great.
I move that we mail ballots to all registered voters and that we invite the towns to join us in that.
Okay, Dave has a motion to mail ballots to all voters.
I second that.
Discussion?
So the original idea was to allow the town clerks to do kind of pretty much what they've always done, which is include those other little slips of paper with the regular ballot, if I'm not mistaken. And when people request a ballot, nothing really changes from what they've experienced in the past. They'll get a bigger piece of paper, because it's a ballot sized piece of paper instead of the little tiny ones. But their normal process of requesting a ballot from the town clerk will result in them getting a school ballot as well, without any extra education or waving a flyer or anything else. If we switch gears and say we want to mail ballots to everyone, that means we have to execute it, because the town clerks aren't set up for that, right? Right now we're piggybacking on top of the town clerk's normal process. And if we decide to go it alone, we're going it alone.
Yes, I think that's a fair statement.
So to continue on that a little bit, I mean, I'm not so concerned about mailing out a gazillion ballots, but how do they return? They would have to return back to the town clerk and the special little envelope and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I believe, I'd have to double check, but I believe they would have to go back to the town clerk, because the process is the town clerks collect all of the ballots in whatever the way they're going to be collected. The town clerk or a representative of the Board of Civil Authority for that town brings those votes to the meeting place, which this time is going to be at Holly Hall as opposed to the central office here. And then a representative of the Board of Civil Authority has to be present, I think, while those are being, in the case of a tabulator, they're present while those go into the tabulator.
And then the voter will be getting a ballot for the school automatically. And they will also have to make the decision to go to the polls or ask the town for a second ballot for the
Correct.
town business.
To vote on the town vote. Yep.
Sarah and Krista have their hand up. So Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, it would be my recommendation to collaborate with town clerks and just, be in concert with what their recommendations are, given these are, for the most part, pretty small communities, and town clerks seem to have a pulse of the community and can reach out to members in their community that, may not reach out to them first to request mail-in ballots. I think it'd be confusing to like, am I going to get a mail-in for the school, but then I'm showing up for the town clerk for everything else? I think that'd be more confusing.
Okay, and Krista.
Yeah, I wanted to second Dave's motion because I wanted us to talk through it a little bit, because conceptually, I really like the idea of making it as easy as possible for all of our community members to vote. But just thinking about the logistics, I think it's good for us to talk through it. Just even seeing the logistics for getting the survey out, it is a huge lift, and probably would be a big lift for town clerks as well. I think that if they were all on board to do it, we could do it together. It would be great. If it's not happening that way this year, maybe it's something we could strive for in future years, because I think our voter participation is pretty low, but it might be too onerous to do that right now.
And Dave, and then Sarah LaPearl.
So my understanding is that this would work very similarly to the way the presidential election worked. Everybody got a ballot, and they had to return that to their own town clerk to vote. They would do that in the same way. I believe that the Secretary of State's office is ready and willing to help communities and supply money for mailing these ballots. And I don't think this would be a particularly good idea if a town didn't want to participate. Then that's why I put in my motion that we would invite all the towns to join us. I would encourage us to have a positive vote tonight. And then if it turned out one or more towns was not willing to participate and the Secretary of State's office was not willing to provide sufficient help, that we would revisit this and revert to having people have to request their absentee ballot from their town clerk.
Sarah LaPearl, and then Rob.
As someone who tried to vote like in person, and we'd gotten them, the two people in our house both messed it up in different ways, and I honor the whole mailing thing, but I would have preferred if I had actually requested it and then gotten it and done it that way myself, and I had a little bit more control over it than having them all sent to me. I had 2 ballots sent to me. It was confusing. So I would prefer if we kept it as simple as possible and went with the town board.
Rob?
Yeah, I agree with Sarah McLean. I mean, let's see if we can find synergy. But I'm also in full support. I think, look, in November, I mean, I hope everyone's vaccinated and everyone could go to the polls and feel safe to go to the polls to give an up or down vote on whatever proposal we put forth as a school board. And I think this idea of sending it out to all the folks in our towns, which I'd hope we'd want to have everyone vote come whatever proposal we put forth in November, this is a great trial run for us. So if we have to go it alone, we have to go it alone. If we can find synergy with town clerks, we can find synergy with town clerks, I think, which would be awesome. But I mean, I'm all for mailing ballots. And if folks don't want to mail it back, then they can go to the polls on March 2nd and they can vote in person. That's what November was like. The COVID numbers are worse than November. I get so frustrated when people don't even acknowledge that. And we were just sort of plowing through and, you know, going forth in life as it is. And let's just acknowledge where we are at with the demographics we have in this district. And so I'd hate to have to go it alone, but I think we really should mail the ballots to all the voters and give them that option at least.
Kevin Hansen?
Dave, would you consider modifying your motion a little bit, make it a little bit more clear that we would encourage the towns to mail 100%, and if they don't, we would align with whatever their decision is?
Maybe. Well, I'm unclear what you're proposing. Why don't you move to amend my motion and we'll see what people say.
Kevin, can I jump in for a second?
Sure.
I'm wondering if we can reverse the motion. In other words, let's make a motion to provide our ballots to the town clerks for people to request both the town ballot and the school ballot together as they would normally do on any year. And we would also embark on at the same time, we would embark on a mission to talk to all the town clerks and see if we can get them all on board with mailing everybody a ballot. And if that happens, then we mail everybody a ballot. But we have the motion taken care of tonight to do it in the sort of the fallback position first. And we stress in the motion that we want to work towards doing the other thing and do that if it's possible. Because I agree, I think everybody should be mailed a ballot. I think that worked great. I don't think people should have a split between just getting one automatically and then having to remember that if they still want to mail in ballot for the town thing, they have to do a separate thing of requesting it. So if we do the fallback position, which is what I think the original idea was, to, you know, follow the normal protocol and let people request them, but mail it to everybody if we can get all the town clerks on board.
So board members, typically we keep this to a board discussion, but we do have a select board member who would like to weigh in. Do you any of you have a problem with hearing from a select board member at this point?
No.
Paul.
Thank you. So I'm on the select board in Lincoln, and we decided, I think it was at the last meeting, that we would vote everything by Australian ballot. and that we would not send out ballots to everybody, but we would revert back to the way that we normally do it, which is people have to request a ballot. I'm not sure how you handle ensuring you know who is a legal voter or not. Those voting lists change a little bit because people move in or they move out of town. And I think there is a 30-day requirement that you notify voters 30 days in advance of the vote as to how you're going to handle this. I'm not sure about that, but I know that there is a time frame because people who vote early can start pretty early. So I just offer that as a piece of information as to how Lincoln has decided to go. I don't know how other towns are handling it.
And one related piece of information to go with that is, as a municipality of our own, it has to all be the same way. So if one town's sending them to all of their electorate and another town's only doing it by request, that's not an option for us. For us, all 5 towns are either by request or all 5 towns are mailing to everyone. So just important to weigh that as we talk about working with towns. Again, my understanding is that all 5 towns are doing it just as Paul described.
Liz Sayer.
Also, and I'd like to add that there's an alternative there. Last fall, I got a postcard, and it asked me, would you like to request a ballot? Like, that was an excellent reminder. And just check the box and send it back, and it was sent. So there are alternatives, like sending out a postcard that reminds people to go ahead and do that, or asking the town clerks if they're doing that again with the spring. I think that should be sufficient.
Dave?
Patrick, did I understand that correctly? So if one of the 5 towns decides to mail to all their citizens, where are we left?
We have to do it the same for all 5 towns, one way or the other, regardless of what a town is doing.
So in that case, we'd have to mail to all our people anyway?
Or do it upon request. I mean, both options still exist. The logistics of making either one happen can be different if towns do different things. But again, my understanding is we know what towns are doing, and that is by request.
Well, we may have to go with what Steve's suggestion is. I think it's unfortunate. I think it, it worked really well in the presidential election, and to require everybody to come in to either request a ballot or come in and vote in person in what Rod described is accurate. The numbers are in fact up, is going to suppress voting. And, I just think voter participation is important in a democracy, and sending a ballot to everybody would be the desirable outcome.
And I guess for what it's worth, another just piece of information, and Krista, you may have a beat on this too, but I believe it's true that when we mail to the entire electorate between printing and postage, it's in the $5,000 to $7,000 range.
Yeah, but I think the Secretary of State will pay for that. And they might even do the mailing.
There are funds to pay for that. Yes, that's a good point, Dave.
Okay, so we still have that motion though on the floor. So we're going to have to either decide to vote it or it's got to be withdrawn. But that's where we are right now. Okay.
You're talking about Dave's motion?
Yes.
That I seconded.
Yes. Okay, so I guess there aren't any more questions. We'll vote on the motion that's currently on the table. Dave's motion was to mail the ballots to all voters and invite the towns to join us in that practice. So Krista, in favor, opposed, or abstaining?
I'm opposed, although I'd like us to see it. I wish we could do it, but I understand it doesn't make sense now. So I'm opposed.
Okay, Sarah McLean.
Opposed?
Okay. Rob,
I'm in favor of Dave's motion.
Dave,
Yes.
okay. Kevin,
Regrettably, no.
okay. Steve,
Yeah, same here. It's a good idea, but I'm opposed to it at the moment.
and Caleb,
No.
okay. Andrew,
No.
and Liz.
No.
Okay.
No.
Oh, and Sarah, okay. 8-2 opposed, so that motion does not carry. Okay. We still have an action though we have to take care of, so.
So I guess I'll move that we include the ballot with the town's ballot and let the town clerks mail them out on request.
Second.
Okay, so that was Steve and Krista. Any further, just any more discussion?
You can early vote still, right?
Yeah. Once everything is properly warned in the time frame, then the ballots usually get printed pretty quickly and then sent out.
Yeah, there's statutory requirements on when that ballot needs to be available. And all that kind of stuff. I don't know the details on it, but it's all out there.
I do know they mail overseas ballots, take like a little over a month. So I know there is at least that 30-day window.
I think the statute is at least 20 days before the vote, the ballot has to be ready.
Okay.
Patrick, I thought maybe it was even in the information you sent that we often do that flyer that goes out.
Yep.
So would we definitely be doing that? And if so, could we insert something in that education piece that goes along with this process that we're doing this year?
Yeah, I think that's why I wanted to include the draft of that flyer tonight so people could see it. And depending on how tonight went, we can be thinking about what, if anything, we might want to add to that or change. Because we have there are going to be some new articles on the Australian ballot now we may want to speak to. And this other educational piece that you're talking about. So we may want to give that some thought as we approach, so that the timeline for that is different. We don't have obviously a hard statutorily required timeline to get that flyer out, but it can be helpful if it dovetails when those other things go out. So if people can reflect on that and be prepared for some feedback on the 26th, that can help us finish that up and get that out.
Well, is that flyer subject to board approval?
That's what we'll be looking at on next Tuesday at our meeting, so. Okay, so the motion was to include the ballots with the town ballots and mail out, so the town clerks can mail out on request. Krista,
Sorry, I approve.
okay, Sarah McLean,
Approve.
Rob,
No.
Dave,
No.
Kevin,
Yes.
Steve,
Yes.
Caleb,
Yes.
Andrew,
Yes.
Liz,
Yes.
and Sarah.
Yes.
8-2 in favor, so the motion passed. All right. Okay. We are not in need of an executive session. And we'll just go back to public comment. Is there anybody who has a public comment now at the end of the meeting? Paul?
Thank you. Just a question. So I assume if you're not voting on your timeline this meeting, are you voting on it next meeting, or did I miss something? I'm sorry.
We're going to vote, we're going to talk about it, and we voted last night to commit to the time for the 7 months. And we're going to take feedback on how we lay out those future meetings and the sort of like that draft of the agenda that we kind of laid out. We're going to get comments on that next week.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question on the, sorry, I know I'm jumping back into public comment here, but do we need both the flyer and the warning?
The flyer helps clarify, because sometimes the language we're required to use in the warning can be confusing. And so the flyer was always a place where we could sort of explain it in a way that it was understandable. If I remember correctly, we put like article such and such, and we gave a little brief explanation of what it meant, because some of the language we have to use sometimes can be confusing.
Okay, and they're going out together? The warning and the flyer?
Not necessarily. Sometimes one comes closer, or that flyer we kind of pick a time when it comes. I think we talk about the best time for it to arrive.
Okay.
I'm
good.
Saw somebody else. I don't know who it was though. It went so fast. Paul. Any other public comment? Okay. So last night at the meeting, when we got to the meeting evaluation, I talked about doing it with tonight's, and I'm wondering if maybe it would be more valuable if we could get a paper copy of it and complete it individually for each meeting, and then have that, because that might be useful as we're planning more in the future, to have everybody do it individually. I mean, I was just thinking about that today, and I'm not saying we have to. I'm just wondering if that might be valuable or worthwhile, since we had these two different kinds of meetings so close together.
When you say paper, do you mean like we would just each individually fill it out electronically and send it to you?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, or we can just do it like we, just do it for tonight. I don't know. I just thought there's probably pieces of each meeting that had plus and minuses. And if you want to share something on the first meeting, that would give you the opportunity to do it, because we didn't do it last night. Kevin?
Would we still tabulate that or collect it in like SurveyMonkey or something? If
I'm not sure about that piece, I guess.
Because at the end of the game,
right,
it's really handy to have it SurveyMonkey spit out what
okay,
we said,
Yep, you're right about that part. Rob, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I've really never met formally in person with this board. How did you do it before COVID?
We just filled it out at the meeting, but last night's meeting went so long that was just kind of like, okay, I didn't want it to be one more thing we were hanging on for. And this one's following in its footsteps. So I guess if we can get it up, we can just do it like we always do as a group. And then if we're going to mention something specific about last night, let's just note it in our comments so that when we're months down the road, we remember we did 2 meetings at 1 evaluation. Does somebody have it up?
I've got it up, Don.
Oh, okay. So think about 2 meetings and in your comments, and
Sorry, I'm going back a year in time. Okay. What is the level of engagement of all board members, high or low?
I think it looks like we're getting thumbs up, so
Aye.
High, okay.
turn on your mics and shout it out.
Was the agenda followed, yes or no?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Any comments?
Yeah, it was not on the website. I need to point that out. The agenda for tonight was not on the MAUSD website.
You are right about that for sure. I reached out to Jennifer. It's there now, which doesn't remedy the 48 hours for sure, but it was shared with all the town clerks, all of the email addresses that are normally shared with. It was posted in all of the schools, and it was on the calendar, not the agenda, but just the meeting itself, just to clarify. And she's very sorry as well.
Yeah, I'm just saying. Factually, it just wasn't there.
I don't know if this fits here, but it was also noted that we need to be more mindful of if we have an action item to have material prior to the meeting when we can, so that the board can discuss it before we're asked to take action.
Yeah, but perhaps you could specifically point that out for the meeting yesterday. That's where it was drawn out.
So that was the meeting on the 20th.
Well, it also applies tonight. The budget information, it's appalling to me that we don't have a finance committee, and the budget, I could barely read it on my screen. Now I don't have a giant screen. Maybe I need to invest in one. And we're going to be asked to vote on this budget probably in the near future. I don't know when it's up for an action item. But I asked some questions. I would be, if I had to vote tonight, I would vote no, because I just have not had time to actually understand the budget that I'm voting for, even though it might be an excellent budget. I'm sure Patrick and Floyd and others have put an awful lot of work into it, but not having information ahead of time and then being asked to take action on items is not a good idea.
I think we're actually voting on it next Tuesday, right?
Correct. Next Tuesday. Liz, did you have your hand up?
Well, yeah, I guess, and a part of me, I just am recalling that also have had the transparency talk before, where sometimes everybody in the community getting access to the same information at the same time, and then we all have till next week to think about it and get feedback. But that's another perspective on that.
Okay, thank you. All right. Chris.
Patrick, I'm assuming you're going to throw this presentation and the detailed version of it up on the website as well.
Right. Like I said at the beginning of the meeting, board members will have this weekend to go through it and look and take a deeper dive on Tuesday. And then the community can watch that meeting and see us going through it again. And then the community has their time at the annual meeting to take a deeper dive in it. And we will have had more time to understand it and get more questions answered. Rob.
Yeah, I just wonder, it seems like this has been my experience since I've been a board member, whether it was last night, the meeting in December, the meeting in November. And I wonder if it's worth us contemplating the fact that if there's going to be information shared and we're going to make action on that information in the meeting, that there should be some time gap between that. I think it's just really not smart on our part to try to digest information in a meeting and then make action on it. And whether or not it's the same amount of time that when a board member requests, adding an action item to the agenda, let's be strategic as a board. Let's set ourselves up to succeed, not be reactionary, but be proactive. And so I would love to have a conversation of what that might look like. Like, is it a week? Is it 3 days? Is it 5 days? And then for the general public, is it 2 days? I think let's be a little more thoughtful. I get it. Like, I mean, I'm throwing myself under the bus. Like, we literally got the final report, and we had less than 20 hours to put together a slideshow yesterday. And my 2 hours that I thought I could have turned into 10 minutes because my daughter didn't want a nap. And so I get those pressure points, but I think let's be strategic as a board and have a conversation. If that seems like a framework we want to have.
There also is a difference between action and information. The budget was presented tonight as information, and I believe your survey results was presented as information, not for action.
Caleb.
Yeah, I should have asked this before. I just wanted to make sure. So when I'm reviewing this weekend, the budget presentation, the district-wide rate that's projected in there of 1.72 something after the 2-cent adjustment, that incorporates the December 1st letter projections for the the statewide so that projects some state projections onto our local spending. And okay, great, because I just I know that we would need a official signal that might be changing in light of revenue changes since December 1st, frankly. But if something like that would come to pass, while it wouldn't affect this budget development, it would affect that math, right? If something changed at the state level.
And for what it's worth, I think the tax rate routinely changes after we've adopted a budget and it moves forward.
Right. Right.
Okay.
So I'm sorry.
I just want to get us back to the survey because we're kind of going back into the meeting.
Ready? Next question? Or are we still discussing?
Caleb's, Dave, is it about the survey?
Well, just in the sense that, I was reprimanded for not allowing 3 days for answers to questions I pose. So that means I have to develop questions about the budget before the weekend, right? I mean, Friday, Monday, Tuesday gives so I have to pose my questions tomorrow, right?
No, you can pose your questions on Tuesday at the meeting. And everybody can hear the answer and participate in if it may stir something that they need more information in the group discussion. Okay, I don't see any more hands, so back to you, Chris.
Okay. Does the chair effectively establish the agenda and materials for distribution to the board? Yes or no?
I think the comment about the documents ahead of time could be a place to work right there.
But there was an agenda established and it was worked off from.
Got it. Is the chair effective in fostering a professional culture regarding fair and open deliberation, full participation of all members, and ensuring the integrity of the board process? Yes or no?
Yes, I would also just note the conversation we had at last night's meeting regarding the letter that was written in the Addison Independent and the conversation surrounding that.
I'd like to note the use of the like attendance sheet to get feedback on our discussions and votes. I appreciate that and think that really helps to foster, making sure we hear everybody's voice.
On the Front Porch Forum today, there was a letter under Patrick's name and signed at the bottom of the letter from the board. So, my constituents think that Patrick's running the board and we're just rubber stampers and why do we even bother? Messages from the board should go out under the board chair's name.
Krista.
Can I just speak to that?
Sure.
That in particular. So I think we are trying to use Front Porch Forum to reach all 5 towns at one time with a unified message on certain factual things like go to the website for this FAQ, or here's the link to a survey. So when we use the MAUSD account, if we spell out that it's a message from the board, the hope is that it makes it clear that it's not a message from the superintendent. So that's why some of the communications are going out that way. I haven't heard that being a point of confusion from anybody. And
It
my
does look
end.
like it's from Patrick because it's Patrick's account.
Mm-hmm.
It's like when
Yeah.
I post a
Heading says a message
post a Front Porch Forum, it looks like it's from Alice because she's the one that made the account. So
Mm-hmm.
Right, and this was purely informational.
I wonder if we can relabel the account to MAUSD.
Each and every board member, including the chair, can have a 5-town account. So the chair could have a 5-town account, publish messages from the school board on the 5-town account under her name, as could you.
I think there's a cost to that.
Well, we're getting off the survey subject here. But there are some things for future discussion, probably.
Just a few.
Chris, back to you.
Other feedback for the chair?
I had one comment, and Don, doesn't matter if you really adopt this or not, but it seems like most of the motions, by and large, are mostly approved or they're approved by a large majority. And it might be quicker if you asked who's against first and simply count the against, and then you wouldn't need to necessarily count the yeses.
Okay.
It just might be faster.
Okay.
What went well with the meeting?
Presentation. Thank you for everybody who worked on that.
The voting went very well. It was efficiently and effectively done.
Thanks for throwing that FY23 on there, Patrick.
Anything else?
Okay. Is that it?
One more, almost there. What suggestions do you have for ways to improve future meetings?
I think we
finally decided to have more, right? That's something we talked about a lot when we had this question come up, so that's good.
And the information sooner. Okay.
We're done.
All right. Thank you, Chris.
No problem.
Okay. It's 9:17. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Andrew,
Second.
Kevin? All right. Well, you can say this one. All in favor of adjourning, please say aye.
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 Good night, everyone.
Good night.
All right. Thank you.